Thank you. Welcome. This is an extraordinary event. I am Karen Peltz Strauss. I am the Deputy Bureau Chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau here at the Federal Communications Commission. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here. This is an absolutely amazing convening of approximately 365 people, or maybe even more, from at least 30 countries. We welcome you all here for this M-enabling event. We look forward to 2 to 3 days, for those of you who are staying for the broadband event, of excellent sharing of ideas and discussions, and we hope that all of you have a very productive meeting. I'm going to pass this over to Axel Lebois right now. I'm going to be coming back and giving a presentation a little bit later in the morning. But right now I'd like to present Axel, who is the founder and executive director of G3 ICT, which is a global initiative for inclusive technologies, an advocacy initiative of the United Nations Global Alliance for ICT and Development. He's a graduate of Sciences Po in Paris. He holds an MBA from INSEAD and has spent more than 20 years at the helm of information technology companies in the U.S. He launched G3 ICT in 2006, and in cooperation with the Secretariat for the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the UNDESA. To promote and facilitate the implementation of the dispositions of the Convention in matters of accessible and assistive ICTs, G3 ICT works in close cooperation with organizations representing persons with disabilities, the ICT industry, the public sector, academia, and the United Nations affiliate organizations. Enjoy, and I will be back.
Thank you very much, Karen. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees of G3 ICT, Ambassador Gallegos, our chairperson, who is the initial chair of the committee that wrote the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability at the UN General Assembly, Mohamed Al-Tarawne, who is the inaugural chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I would like to extend to you the warmest welcome. Sometimes people ask me, how can we get 370 people to come from 32 countries to this event? And I would tell you it's a mix of friendship, it's a mix of commitment of people around the room here to the cause of persons with disabilities, and a mix of very innovative thinking in finding solutions for persons with disabilities. We are thrilled to see the level of interest that this event is bringing. And we look at the next 3 days as an opportunity to really foster a new dialogue on a global basis between the different stakeholders that take part in the mobile industry and serve persons with disabilities. So today I would like to tell you that over the next 3 days, we'll have 3 major segments in our proceedings. This morning is the time when we would like to listen to some of the best experience in establishing policies, programs from a government standpoint, and there is little better place than the FCC, and looking at the new legislation, 21st Century Communication and Video Accessibility Act, and the current rulemaking here to understand the stake of such initiatives that are occurring in also many countries today. This afternoon, we'll take a completely different angle, and we'll listen to service providers, mobile service providers, some of the leading companies in the world, who have determined that, in fact, persons with disabilities are a great market to serve, and that if you take the right business approach with the right business processes in place, you can serve the community of persons with disabilities with a very, very effective business model. So we will look at those examples this afternoon. It's very important that industry participates with the appropriate motivation to this whole dialogue. Tomorrow, we'll look at technology innovations. how the chip industry, handset manufacturers, operating system providers, and application developers, what kind of innovations, if I may say so, are in the pipeline for persons with disabilities. And then we'll devote the rest of the day to look at the myriad of new applications that are popping up on mobile platforms that bring incredible new solutions for persons with disabilities. So by tomorrow night, we hope we can, the day after tomorrow night, we hope we can derive some very key conclusions and learnings from this unique opportunity to meet all together. So you in the room have an extraordinary concentration of expertise. So my call to action to you all is try to exchange as much as you can during this summit and try to make sure that this unique opportunity is fully leveraged. Be blunt, be open, contact people, talk to people, make new things happen. I would like, in conclusion, to thank our partner, E.J. Cross and Associates, and I see Ned Cross standing here, with whom this whole thing would not be possible. So please join me in thanking him for his incredible support. With this, I would like to proceed with the agenda today and introduce our first speaker. And we are extremely honored today to have Mr. Karim Dale, who is the Associate Director at White House Office of Public Engagement and Special Assistant to the President for Disability Policy. Well, in short, we should say President Obama, lead person for disability policy in the US, to address us and tell us how the current administration sees the new legislation as a cornerstone of the policy for persons with disabilities. So Mr. Dale coordinates the administration efforts to see that people with disability are on a level playing field with all Americans. Originally from Chicago, Mr. Dale previously served as the National Disability Director for the Obama for America campaign. He also served on the Arts Policy Committee and the Disability Policy Committee for then Senator Obama. Mr. Dale graduated from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign with a bachelor's degree in advertising in May '95. He received his Juris Doctor and joint MBA degree in May of 1999 from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, graduating cum laude. Mr. Dale has been an extraordinary advocate and great supporter of all of our endeavors, and I really would like you to help me welcome him at the stage.
Thank you very much, Axel, for that introduction. Very much appreciated. I want to thank Commissioner Clybourn for hosting us, and I want to thank Karen for all of her incredible work. The FCC has been at the forefront of our work on disability policy throughout the administration. I want to thank them for their efforts, and I apologize in advance that I have to rush out right after my remarks, have to head back to the White House, so I apologize. I think you all are going to have a great event today and over the next couple of days. I am sure with the leadership of Commissioner Clybourn and with Karen and with Axel and the Secretary and so many of others that have made this possible. On behalf of the President of the United States, I want to welcome everybody to the FCC and to the United States for this extraordinary event, both here in America, right here at home, and both abroad. The President has renewed the commitment to improving the lives of the millions and millions and millions of persons with disabilities around the world. We have had a number of significant achievements that have reshaped the landscape for Americans with disabilities, both here in our country and living abroad. The President signed an executive order to make the federal government a model employer for persons with disabilities, reshaping the landscape of the largest employer in our country, the federal government. Our commitment is strong, making sure that people with disabilities have an opportunity and have equal opportunity to work in our federal government. But what is clear is that everything must work together. And so if you have employment, you must ensure that you have good technology. That's why the President just this past July, on the 21st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, announced that we would be launching a new strategic plan to improve Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which governs ensuring that federal government technology is accessible for all. That strategic plan is in development and will be released in the next few months, and it is going to once again, or for the first time perhaps, systematize to ensure that processes and procedures for purchasing software, developing software are accessible for our federal government workers, making sure that technology is working for federal government, but hopefully that work will extend to the private sector. And on the private sector, of course, the President signed the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act just last year, which you'll be hearing more about from Karen. And I am a firm believer that the new energy and the new focus and the new commitment to people with disabilities that President Obama brought into this administration opened the doors to ensuring that these types of efforts and this type of historic legislation would be possible and would lead to bigger and better and greater things for people with disabilities everywhere. These are some of the things that the President has done right here at home, but also working abroad. The President, 6 months after he took office, he had made a commitment that the United States would sign the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and 6 months thereafter, after we took office, the President did just that, bringing the United States at that time to be the 141st country to sign the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We are working hard on a ratification package to submit to the Senate, and the President has repeatedly stated that once we submit that package, we expect swift advice and consent by the United States Senate to once again bring the United States to the table so that it can serve as a leader along with many other countries on ensuring the rights of persons with disabilities around the world are protected and enforced. So it is our pleasure to welcome all of you all to the FCC and to the United States. Rest assured that President Obama is committed to improving the lives of the nearly 1 billion people with disabilities around the world, and we look forward to working with you all in the next couple of days, but also in the months and years ahead. Thank you again to Commissioner Clyburn for her gracious hosting and all of the work of the entire FCC team. Thank you very much.
I told you I'd be back, and I'm back already. It is my honor, first of all, to mention a few people in the audience that you should know. Mindell Latourie, are you still here? There she is, if you could stand up. Mindell is the head of our international bureau. Many of you here probably have already had some dealings with her bureau, if not with Mindell as well, and she and her staff were very helpful in helping to put together this event. Also Joel Gurin, the bureau chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, my boss, who has also been incredibly supportive in letting me do whatever I need to do with respect to disability access, and provides all the encouragement and enthusiasm that any bureau chief can offer to these issues. I also want to recognize Pam Gregory. Is she in the room? Okay, well, where? Oh, there she is. Stand up, Pam. Who is the director of our Accessibility and Innovation Initiative, and Jamal Mazrui, are you in the room as well? There you are in the back, who is the deputy director. The Accessibility and Innovation Initiative, which you'll hear more about hopefully over the next few days, is an effort to bring industry and consumers together in a collaborative effort to find solutions, to identify problems and find solutions to accessibility issues. I also want to mention Susan McLean, if she is here. Now, most of these people are, oh, there she is, all the way in the back, who is the head of our Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division, who has overseen the logistics of this conference. And she has an amazing staff of people that will make this all seem like it has run very smoothly, when in fact, you know, that putting together something this size is quite a task. Now it is my incredible privilege and honor to introduce to you Commissioner Mignon Clyburn. Commissioner Clyburn is, without a doubt, one of the chief champions of the rights of people with disabilities in this country, let alone at this commission. She looks out not only for people with disabilities, but for the unserved and the underserved in virtually all federal communications policy. She makes sure that these people do not get lost as communications policy is developed, and has been, and we hope continues to be, an aggressive advocate to ensure that people with disabilities are not left behind and are able to benefit from communications technologies and innovation as it marches forward. I am delighted to introduce to you one of the people here at the Commission that I admire most, Commissioner Mignon Clyburn.
Thank you so very much, Karen, for starting off my morning right. I really appreciate that. There's not often at the agency you get affirmations, so an affirmation first thing in this morning. Thank you. I really appreciate it. That might be the only one I get today, so I'm going to embrace it. Again, good morning, everyone. For those of you who have worked closely with Karen, you already know that she's a real heroine for people living with disabilities. She was one of the most influential advocates in the effort to enact the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, or as we like to say, CVAA, because we are consumed and just obsessed with acronyms. But this is the most significant piece of federal legislation since the enactment of Americans with Disabilities Act. Karen has brought her terrific advocacy here to help ensure that the FCC adopts the most appropriate rules to implement the CVAA, and these efforts are receiving much deserved international attention, and we thank you so very much. We are so thrilled to welcome all of you here at the FCC. I wish everyone could have a panoramic view that I have. There are over 350 persons we estimate in the audience here today, representing as many as 30 countries and several federal agencies. That is just truly awesome. We are so proud to share with you information about the laws we have passed and the policies we have adopted to ensure that people with disabilities everywhere have access to mobile technologies. Disability access has been one of my chief priorities during my tenure here as an FCC commissioner. One of my other priorities, however, is to learn as much as I can from others who are working in similar policy areas. Over the next few days, we look forward to learning more about what your countries are doing to promote accessibility for people living with disabilities. We want to exchange and build upon our respective successes in that field. We have a wonderful staff here at the FCC dedicated to promoting greater accessibility. So you should know that you are in good hands during the time you spend at this conference. We, of course, will start off the morning. We already heard from Mr. Dale, my good friend Dr. Toure, and our founder, well, chief architect of this initiative or this movement or this event, Mr. Lebois. Thank you very much. I deserve a hand for that. Thank you. Thank you. No, for bringing this audience together, for bringing 30 countries, over 350 persons together for a worthwhile cause, a worthwhile mission to ensure that people all over the world share the same opportunities, share the same advantages as everyone else in the world. That is a priority for me, and I want to thank you for your efforts in ensuring that our priorities, your priorities, are the world's priorities. Thank you very much and have a successful conference.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Clyburn, and I would like to take this opportunity to say how much we appreciate the FCC's team responsiveness when we came here to suggest that perhaps we could have a session on mobile accessibility. The response was incredible, and the support we got here at the FCC from the entire team has been just wonderful. So thank you so much for your introduction remarks, and thank you to the entire team of the FCC for helping putting us this session here on policies and regulations about mobile accessibility. this brings a lot of, I think, added interest to the entire summit, and we really appreciate your cooperation. This morning, it's also my great honor to welcome the Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union, Mr. Hamadoun Touré. Dr. Touré has been an incredible supporter of the cause of persons with disabilities at the ITU for a long time. In fact, the ITU is probably one of the organizations among the United Nations affiliated organizations that has devoted the most effort to look at the issue of accessibility for persons with disabilities. Mr. Touré, Dr. Touré has been also overseeing the Department of Development at the ITU for many years, and then he was subsequently elected Secretary General in January of 2007. And Dr. Touré comes from industry, comes from the satellite industry with an incredible private sector background, so has both the perspective from government and the perspective from the private sector when he talks about issues related to accessibility. Dr. Touré was re-elected for a second term as Secretary General of the ITU in October of 2010, and he has actually, always been very committed to ITU as an innovative, forward-looking organization adapted to meeting the challenges created by the rapidly changing ICT environment, and continuing to spearhead ITU toward implementing the resolution of the World Summit on the Information Society and achieving the Millennium Development Goals. It's important to remind the audience that those are very important objectives for the ITU. Beyond the standardization, the technical efforts, and all the issues that ITU deals on a day-to-day basis, it has an overall objective to bring the benefit of information technology to all. With that, please help me welcome Dr. Touré to the stage.
Good morning, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I would like, first of all, to thank Axel for this very nice introduction. I would like to say how pleased I am to be here in Washington this morning for the M-Enabling Summit, which is being organized by G3ICT, the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, in cooperation with the Federal Communication Commission, and ITU, the United Nations Agency for Information and Communication Technologies. I'm delighted, of course, to see so many good friends here. Andrea Sachs, Cynthia, my friend Dambele from Mali, and many other people committed for the common cause. And I'm really delighted to be organizing, co-sponsoring this with G3ICT. At ITU, we are committed to connecting the world, and I'm pleased to be able to report that thanks to mobile technologies, we have largely achieved this objective with over 6.3 billion mobile cellular subscriptions worldwide and 2.3 internet users. ICTs are now within reach of almost all the world's people, even those in the poorest, most rural, and most isolated regions in the world. But there is still one very large segment of society which is underserved and underconnected. I'm referring, of course, to the 1 billion people with disabilities of some kind or another who face accessibility issues. These include complex human interfaces which can be hard to use for those with cognitive impairments or learning disabilities, a lack of alternatives for people with poor eyesight or hearing, and handset ergonomics, which simply weren't designed for persons with physical disabilities. The majority of people living with disabilities are often invisible, either because their disabilities are not immediately obvious or because they have fewer opportunities to interact in everyday social life. But just because people are less visible does not mean they don't have the same right to communicate as everyone else. On Saturday, we all celebrated the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and it is therefore timely and appropriate here in Washington today to look at ways in which technology, and especially mobile technologies, can be made more accessible. Ladies and gentlemen, at ITU we take accessibility issues very seriously and have been working hard over the past years to address the issues from a number of different angles, and particularly through the work of our standardization and development sectors. All of our work in this area is designed to help achieve the goal of equitable communications for everyone, with a focus on accessible design, availability, and affordability. Accessible design means that accessibility has to be built into the products and services from the very beginning. Availability means that accessible products and services must be available to everyone who needs them. And affordability means that accessible products and services must be reasonably priced and made available to the largest number of people. The ITU standardization sector has been working at improving ICT accessibility standards for some years. Indeed, several of our ITU-T study groups are now working on human factors and accessibility, and all of our study groups use an accessibility checklist when starting work on new standards. And I believe my friend Andrea Sachs has been very, very keen to ensure that we do respect this rule, and it is in the ITU, and we are very proud of that. The creation and adoption of international telecommunication standards helps to promote the development of assistive products and services that are interoperable on a global basis. These can be simple improvements such as standardizing telephone service pictograms, symbols, and icons, or more complex ones such as defining the requirements for sign language and lip reading in video materials. In our accessibility standardization work, I must pay tribute to the United States delegation, whose leadership and contributions have been and continue to be hugely appreciated. It's an opportunity for me to again congratulate Commissioner Clyburn for her commitment in this area and the huge work being done by the United States administration. In this regard, I'm particularly looking forward to attending this morning's session on 21st Century Communications and the Video Accessibility Act. Let me also encourage you to join our ITU standardization sessions here in Washington tomorrow, where you will be able to see presentations on the broad range of our accessibility activities. Distinguished colleagues, turning now to ITU development sector, we also do valuable accessibility work here in helping our member states understand and meet their obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, encouraging the exchange of best practices, helping to develop and promote policy guidelines and provide policy advice, developing pioneering projects such as a text-to-speech engine in the Mongolian language, and creating greater awareness through conferences and publications. A good example of this last activity is the new thematic report we have just published in cooperation with G3 ICT on making TV accessible, which is available for free download from ITU website. The report was prepared by Peter Olaf Looms, chairman of the ITU-T focus group on audiovisual media accessibility. It looks at ways in which this near ubiquitous technology, televisions, are present in virtually all households in the developed world and 3/4 of those in the developing world, that this technology can be made more accessible. Television is going digital, and I firmly believe the transition to digital terrestrial broadcasting represents an excellent opportunity for ITU members to make the necessary steps to ensure TV is accessible. Another very positive result of our cooperation with G3 ICT has been the development and launch last year of the e-accessibility policy toolkit for policymakers, which has already become a primary reference in matters of ICT accessibility among international policymakers. The policy toolkit was developed with the participation of over 65 experts from around the world, many of whom are in this room today. And I would like to express my sincere appreciation for this remarkable collaborative work across borders. Finally, I would like to highlight one more publication entitled Making Mobile Phones and Services Accessible for Persons with Disabilities. An electronic draft of this report will be distributed by ITU and G3 ICT this afternoon, and it will be updated and published shortly after the summit to incorporate key findings. So I will hope to have your inputs to finalize this report. I think that we can all agree that sharing good practices and solutions that work to benefit everyone with a disability is a necessity for all stakeholders. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, ratified by 106 countries and signed by 154, clearly defines ICT accessibility as an imperative. Indeed, the majority of ITU member states have ratified the convention and now seek to actively ensure that mobile accessibility and mobile assistive solutions are widely available and affordable. This M-Enabling Summit will help ITU members to meet this vital goal. I must say I'm very much encouraged by the very large participation from so many people and from so many countries here. This is encouraging for me, and I can assure you that we will continue the work in ITU, given the strong support that you are giving to this activity. Let me close by emphasizing the power of partnership. Through partnership, we are here today, and I'm delighted that G3 ICT took the initiative in getting us all together to collaborate on this important summit, getting all the stakeholders together to share solutions which are workable and sustainable from both a technical and business standpoint is beneficial to all. It also allows us to look at how policies, incentives, and regulations can support the development of a successful ecosystem dedicated to mobile accessibility and mobile assistive technologies. Last but not least, in a world where 1 in 7 people suffers from some kind of disability, we must make ICTs not just more accessible in themselves, but also leverage the incredible power of ICTs to drive sustainable social and economic progress for all the world's people, and especially for those with disabilities. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your keynote address, and thank you for your very kind remarks, and we are very, very honored and pleased that you will be able to come and join us for this summit and open the summit. Our next activity this morning is the presentation of the 21st Century Communication and Video Accessibility Act, and I would like to first introduce Mrs. Karen Pell-Strauss, Deputy Chief, Consumer and Government Affairs Bureau at the FCC. Mrs. Pell-Strauss has over 25 years of experience working on issues concerning telecommunications access for people with disabilities. Before joining the FCC, she co-founded the Coalition of Organizations for Accessible Technology, or CORDS, a coalition of over 300 national and regional organizations dedicated to ensuring disability access to emerging internet-based and digital communication technologies in the 21st century. I should also add that she is the author of my Bible, which is like a huge, thick book, which includes every single thing that happened in the United States from a technology and legislation standpoint, which is a remarkable reference. Mrs. Pelstras also served as legal counsel for Gallaudet University's National Center for Law and Deafness and the National Association of the Deaf. In 2006, Mrs. Pelstras published a new civil right, Telecommunication Equality for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Americans, which is the Bible I was just referring to. So with this, please help me welcome Mrs. Pelstras to the stage.
Thank you. So would the panelists, Jennifer, Paul, Susan, and Claude, please come up and take a place at the stage on the panel? And while everybody's getting settled, first of all, Axel, thank you so much for that kind introduction. While everybody's getting settled, I'd actually like to just have the people in the Disability Rights Office and the Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division please stand if you're in the room. These are the FCC staff that do the work, okay? They are the ones, yes, they deserve a round of applause. Including Michaela, who you will see running in and out of the room and around the room throughout the conference. She is amazing in terms of making sure that all the logistics work out. So this morning we have a very, very esteemed panel. I'm going to briefly give you overviews of their bios because we are very tight on time. But I can just tell you that I've had the privilege of working with all four of these individuals for way too long in terms of how old I am, so I'm not going to go into that, but I'd say a minimum of 20 years, some as much as 30 years. Paul Schrader, if you could raise your hand, Paul. Paul is currently the Vice President of Programs and Policy for the American Foundation for the Blind. He joined the staff of AFB in 1994. And he provides leadership in AFB's efforts to improve services and policies related to the needs of people with hearing loss. He's responsible for their legislative and public policy and also oversees the web-based technology magazine Access World, Technology and People Who Are Blind or Visually Impaired. For the entire time that I've known Paul, he has worked to encourage coalition building, collaboration, and constructive dialogue around disability issues, and was very instrumental in the efforts of the Coalition of Organizations for Accessible Technology, which, for the sake of saving time and Washington, D.C. acronyms, we will from now on call COAT, C-O-A-T. He is known nationally and internationally for his efforts to foster greater access to mobile phones, which is the subject matter of this conference. Claude Stout. Claude, can you raise your hand? He's the Executive Director of Telecommunications for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, also known as TDI. He serves as chair of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing Consumer Advocacy Network, a national coalition of 20 organizations that is dedicated to representing deaf and hard of hearing citizens in public policy and legislative issues, and is also a member of the FCC's Consumer Advisory Committee. Before that, he served as Assistant Director for Community Affairs with the North Carolina Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, Executive Director with the Missouri Commission for the Deaf, Assistant Executive Director for Business Services with the National Association of the Deaf, and he has a Master's of Business Administration from Gallaudet University and a Bachelor of Science degree from Gallaudet. Susan Mazrui, if you could raise your hand. Susan's been involved in accessibility issues also for as long as I can remember, starting off at Pacific Bell. She assisted in the development of sections 255 and 508 product development strategies at SBC and Singular Wireless. She is now working on national and international disability-related public policy and serves as the liaison with national disability organizations for AT&T services. She has served also on the FCC's Consumer Advisory Committee, was a 2002 Summit on Leading Diversity Corporate Fellow, and was inducted into the Spinal Cord Injury Hall of Fame in 2008. She has an MA in Education from San Francisco State University, is a founding member of the Committee on Disability, Power, and Pride, currently chairs the Board of Directors at the World Institute on Disability, and also serves on the board of the U.S. Business Leadership Network and is a trustee for the American Foundation for the Blind. Jennifer Simpson. Raise your hand. I know you're the last one left, but you might as well get credit. Jennifer is co-founder and co-chair to COAT, which, by the way, has now over 315 national and community-based organizations that advocates for Accessibility Coalition and was the driving force behind the passage of the CVAA. Previously, she was a senior director for government affairs at the American Association of People with Disabilities, which is a national cross-disability organization in D.C. that advocates for all the independence of all people with disabilities. While there, she led the Telecommunications and Technology Policy Initiative, initiated the Health Information Technology Project, a broadband awareness campaign, a digital TV transition, consumer education product, and an emergency awareness outreach mission. Before going to AAPD, she was actually here at the FCC, where she oversaw the complaints division of the Disability Rights Office and implemented various disability accessibility mandates that are contained in the Communications Act. She has also had a stint as an employment advisor at the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities, and before that government service, she worked for the United Cerebral Palsy Associations. So you can see that we have collectively an amazing group of people here. I'm going to sit at the podium and give my presentation from the panel rather. And the way this is going to work this morning is I will give a presentation on the CVAA, and then the panelists will respond to that presentation. Access to telecommunications and technology. We all know what it means. We all know why we're here. It means access to jobs and education and information, recreation, marketplace, transportation, independence, and privacy. It's the key to accessing virtually everything in mainstream society. It's important for all of the people here to understand that the CVAA did not get developed in a vacuum. Many of you are familiar with our laws, but I thought that it would be helpful to give you an overview of how we got from there to here, what occurred in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s that brought us to this point. If we go far back, we go to 1973, when the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was passed. Part of that act contains Section 508. Section 508 has since been amended and improved and requires accessible technologies in the electronic information and communications fields for people with disabilities when these are provided by and procured by the federal government. So we started off in this country with looking at making the federal government a model for society, and that started with the Rehabilitation Act. Jump ahead to 1982, when the very first law that addressed putting some requirements or obligations on industry was passed. This was the Telecommunications Act of 1982, and that required that certain phones, called essential phones, be hearing aid compatible. It meant that phones had to have certain inductive coupling. If you used a hearing aid, that you'd be able to trigger and then be able to use phones more clearly, eliminating background noise. But it was very limited. It actually only talked about reasonable access and essential phones, as if there were phones that were not essential. It also, though, had a provision in it that allowed cross-subsidization between telephone services and specialized customer premises equipment for people with disabilities. So the one thing that was very good about that law was the first recognition of Congress that telecommunications is important for people with disabilities in order to participate in the mainstream of society. Some advocates that had been working on hearing aid compatibility issues weren't satisfied with what the 1982 Act did, and so they worked and went back to Congress, and in 1988, Congress passed a second law called the Hearing Aid Compatibility Act. That expanded the requirements to require all telephones, wireline telephones and cordless telephones, to be hearing aid compatible. It also provided that wireless phones, while exempt at that time, that exemption could be reviewed by the FCC and eventually eliminated. And in fact, that is what eventually happened. And now we have comprehensive laws requiring a good percentage of wireless phones to be accessible. In fact, we don't get complaints. I shouldn't say this too loudly, but we don't really get complaints anymore about hearing aid compatible wireless phones because so many phones are now compatible. In 1988, Congress also adopted the Telecommunications Accessibility Enhancement Act. Again, we have a situation here where Congress decided that the FCC, or rather that the federal government, would be the trendsetter in providing access. In this case, it was for telecommunications relay services. This required that the federal government establish a relay system to allow people who were deaf and hard of hearing to communicate with hearing people, at that time only TTYs to voice, where a relay operator in the middle would convey whatever the TTY user typed to the hearing person of the telephone call and type back to the TTY user. At that time, there was no video relay, speech-to-speech, or any other kind of relay. Jump ahead to 1990, that telecommunications relay service was pretty limited. It only handled calls between people making calls from the federal government to the outside, to the federal government, and within the federal government. So consumers went back to Congress and said, no, we need more. Little by little, our states were developing relay services, but these services were very inconsistent. They limited the time of day that calls could be made. They limited the number of calls. They limited the length of calls. There was no confidentiality required. And so Congress decided to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, as you know, is a global law that covers far more than telecommunications issues. But Title IV of the ADA does require that we have a nationwide telecommunications relay service. And just in case any of you are not familiar with it, people do not pay for calls. The cost of this service is incorporated in the general costs of telephone service. So anybody using a relay service does not pay individually for it. There was also a provision in the ADA that requires telephone access to our local emergency services. In the United States, we dial 911. This basically meant at the time that if you use a TTY, you have to be able to access 911 directly. In 1990 also, Congress wasn't quite ready to require closed captioning on TV, but what they did instead is they passed the Television Decoder Circuitry Act, which required closed captioning capability on TVs with screens over 13 inches, so that all of these television sets would now have the capability to pass through captions. This was designed to encourage broadcasters and cable networks to include captioning because now everybody would be able to have it. Well, that wasn't enough, and in 1996, consumers, actually in 1989, consumers started going back to Congress, and eventually in 1996, we got passed a law that requires captioning. And so, as you know, we now have very comprehensive captioning requirements in the United States. Virtually all new programming, with only a few exemptions, have to be captioned, and older programming, 75%. Also at that time, Section 255 was enacted requiring access to telecommunications products and services. How did all these laws get enacted? One of the things that we have in the Communications Act, and all of these laws, by the way, are part of the Communications Act, is a principle called universal service. And it's the obligation to make sure that everybody in America has equal and affordable access to our communications network. Also, it was recognized that the marketplace does not work for people with disabilities. As much as there are huge numbers of people with disabilities in America, it's estimated at around 54 to 56 1.6 million Americans, because there are discrete populations, blind, deaf, hard of hearing, mobility disabled, cognitively disabled. Each of these markets are not forceful enough. They don't have enough market power enough to influence the market to design for accessibility. So Congress and the FCC have to step in. And again, throughout all of this, Congress has recognized that if you do not have access to these telecommunications networks and systems, you are going to lose access to everything. Again, going back to that first slide, employment, education, recreation. And also, it's the recognition of television. A lot of these laws cover television, not only as a tool or a recreational system, but also a tool of learning and social acceptance. Most importantly, there was the recognition that telecommunications access is a civil right. But when we got to the turn of the century, something happened. Many of us at this table had worked on these laws. We all thought, okay, great, we can now rest, we can retire, we can go do the things that we want to with our families. And then something called the internet came along, and we looked at each other and said, we're never going to rest. We have to go back. We have to do this all over again, because none of these laws that we passed, that Congress enacted, address the internet. So we started all over again, and we also realized that there still weren't mandates for video description, and there were various other gaps in the laws. There was limited captioning capability on televisions. I mentioned before that it only covered screens, televisions with screens up to 13 inches. Well, at the time that that law was passed, 97% of all televisions had screens of 13 inches, so we thought we were good. Then something called the iPhone came along, and the MP3 player, and the iPad, and all the pads, and we said, my God, there's no access to any of this. There were no protections for the deafblind population as well, and the emergency access, that provision that we had gotten enacted in Title II of the ADA, it was good at the time. It allowed TTY users to access 911 emergency services, but it didn't really cover the future of this next generation of network that we're building here that will allow the conveyance of voice, data, pictures, you name it, text. It didn't really cover that. So we said, nope, we cannot rest yet. We need to make sure that the protections enacted by Congress start keeping up with emerging technologies. The prior focus was on telecommunications and legacy technologies. Now we need to move into the 21st century. I mentioned before the market failures. This is a theme that is repeated over and over and over here, and that's why I repeated it, because when consumers and advocates go to Congress and industry addresses these issues, everybody recognizes the disability market is too small. Again, when broken up, the lower incomes mean that the purchasing power is left. A lot of times there's need for adaptive equipment, and that discourages mainstream purchases. The government has stepped in and addresses accessibility needs to promote innovation while at the same time not overly burdening industry. The goal is to incorporate, as Commissioner Clyburn mentioned, access at the design stages. We all know that once something is built, it is much harder to retrofit it. If you build it in early, not only is it cheaper and more integrated into the product, but it works better. The telecommunications relay system is a nearly $1 billion retrofit for a telephone system that doesn't work. Probably the biggest retrofit of all. And most importantly, when you build in access, what happens? Everybody uses it. We find this with closed captioning. We find this with curb cuts. We find this with vibrating cell phones. We find this with talking caller IDs. Everybody ends up benefiting. Okay, finally, the communications, 21st century communications and video programming accessibility act. I just totally botched that name. The 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. Okay, I think I got it right this time. We're going to call it again the CVAA. Title I of the CVAA requires that communications be, again, accessible to people with disabilities and brought into the 21st century. It requires access to advanced advanced, actually, that should say communications, not telecommunications. That's an important distinction. Interconnected and non-interconnected voice over internet protocol, electronic messaging, interoperable video conferencing, accessible internet browsers on mobile devices, those hearing aid compatibility mandates that I talked about. As we use VoIP phones or other advanced communication devices, it has to apply to them. It updates the relay service definition. Right now, we have all kinds of different relay services, and it allows a user of video relay, which uses sign language interpreters, to talk to somebody who uses a text type of relay. It also adds the definition, within the definition of relay, the deaf-blind population. It updates who has to contribute to pay for relay to not only telecommunications providers, but also VoIP providers. It authorizes funding for a new national deaf-blind equipment distribution program, which is the first time that Congress has ever done anything like this. We are now in the middle of implementing this program. It will give out equipment for free, up to $10 million a year, to people who are deaf-blind, to enable them to access advanced communication services and regular telecommunication services. And also it authorizes rules, again, to make sure that people with disabilities can access our next generation emergency system. Title II covers video programming. It says that when programs are shown on television, remember, we have great rules for television. They all have to be captioned, nearly all, at least the new programming. But when they go over to the internet, there were no rules covering that. So this says once those shows are shown on television, move over to the internet, they have to also be captioned. And this is a proceeding that we're working on right now. People that are blind right now don't really have access to emergency information shown on television. This law requires that. It requires that video programming devices, that 13-inch requirement that we talked about, out the window. If it's technically feasible and achievable, all of these newer devices are going to have to pass through or render video, closed captioning, video description, and the accessible emergency information. Try accessing your television set. Try changing the menu or and navigating to find a program if you're blind. Close your eyes, go home, try to do it. You cannot do it. What this requires is that user interfaces and on-screen text menus and programming guides used for the navigation and selection of program be accessible to people who cannot read visual displays. Video programming devices, as I said, in addition to providing the pass-through or rendering of closed captioning and video description, you have to be able to access those features if you are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, visually impaired, etc. In other words, it can't be buried in a menu. It has to be easy to get that access to that. It even covers recording apparatus, where the recording like VCRs or DVRs, where the recording apparatus can convey video programming. It requires that the interconnection mechanisms also not block captions. The CVAA also closes a major gap for video description. And, you know, I always like to say that we're ahead of the world, but on this one, some of you are ahead of us, so we're trying to catch up. It requires, finally, that a certain amount of television program contain video description, which are narrations in programming that fill in the natural pauses to allow blind people to follow a program's dialogue. 4 national networks, broadcast networks in the top 25 markets, the top 5 cable channels must provide 4 hours of primetime or children's program per week, and eventually we are allowed to expand that to approximately 7 hours. We're also allowed to expand the market areas. So just as a review, looking at what was before and what was after. Before we had coverage under Section 255 for telecommunications, the CVAA extends that to advanced communications. Before we had captioning rules for television, the CVAA expands that for the internet. In parentheses on my PowerPoint, what I've noted is the dates on which we have to issue rules. We already have rules on advanced communication services. For internet delivered programming, we are expecting to issue rules this coming January. Caption decoder standards. We issued standards for those in 1997 and 2000 for analog and digital programming or digital devices. We have to issue new rules again in 2012. The video description rules we have already issued. We originally had rules in the year 2000. Those were overturned, and we restored those rules already this past year. Telecommunications relay services. We already issued rules on contributions to TRS by VoIP providers. We already issued the rules on our National Deafblind Equipment Distribution Program, and next year we will issue rules expanding the TRS definition. We will also be issuing rules on hearing aid compatibility. We also have created 2 advisory committees. One is the Emergency Access Advisory Committee to guide us on how to best meet the needs of people with disabilities in next generation emergency systems, and the Video Programming Accessibility Advisory Committee to advise us on all of the Title II components of the law. We have a responsibility at the FCC to have created not only the rules but also an accessibility clearinghouse, and we have done that. Feel free to visit it. We have to issue biennial reviews to reports to Congress to keep us on our toes, and we have to handle all of the complaints that come in. For more information, I've provided a website, http:// This is a long name. I will give this to anybody who wants it. But please feel free to subscribe to accessinfo@fcc.gov. That will keep you apprised of all of the things that we do. I hope you have a wonderful summit and a holiday season. And now I'm going to pass this over to Susan Mazrui, who will start off. If each of you could take about 5 minutes for your presentations, we'd appreciate it. Thank you. Raise your hand. Yep, there it's on. Okay.
My name is Susan Mazrui. I work for AT&T. Some of you know me for the work that I've done in advocacy around disability access. Some of you know me from the work that I do in industry. Half of my time when I do presentations, I go to industry organizations and say the slogan from the disability rights movement, which is nothing about us without us. Meaning that when you're making decisions that pertain to people with disabilities, you need to have people with disabilities involved. The other part of my job is that I go to disability organizations representing industry saying nothing about us without us. And it's nice to be here today where I could say the same thing across the board. The critical part of making advanced communications accessible is really the understanding that advanced communications is an ecosystem. You cannot design for people with disabilities if you do not have them involved. You cannot design communication systems without industry involved. The lines of communication, oddly enough, or not surprisingly, are the critical when you're developing communication systems, whether it's wireless or wireline, whether it's looking at internet-based services or more traditional services. You need to have that open communications. When you're looking at a global world, you also have to look at harmonization, because part of that communication is having systems that can interact with each other. These things do not happen accidentally. Organizations invest a great deal of time and expertise in making this happen. Industries, government agencies need to all work together to look at the harmonization of standards to make sure that when we are developing systems moving forward, that they are accessible. The real breakthrough for the CVAA is saying that we're not going to design to something that's past and old, because we know that that won't work in the technology of today, which is moving so quickly forward. And the systems that we develop internally to address these, whether it's a disability organization, whether it's a company, whether manufacturer or service provider, whether it's a regulator, we all need to make sure that what we're doing is allowing for enough innovation to move forward, while at the same time making sure that the needs of the individuals we're designing for are being addressed. It's very basic, but it's very difficult. The successes that AT&T has had, and I'll talk from that perspective because that's my experience, has really come from our AT&T advisory panel on access and aging, which includes some of the folks here, but a lot of other folks who help us determine what our direction needs to be, whether we're on course or whether we need to change our course slightly, and what are critical to our customer base of people with disabilities. While the singular population of blind people or people who are deaf and those markets may not necessarily be a driver in all cases, the reality is people with disabilities are throughout our societies. People are aging throughout our societies. And there are deaf engineers and there are deaf poets. There are blind computer programmers and there are blind literature professors. You have people throughout life stages and they're everywhere. So companies can and should make the opportunity to look at including technologies that are accessible throughout life stages and throughout differences. And that doesn't mean that you make a product that is not accessible. One of our best success stories really has to do with looking at the aging population. We developed a phone with one of our vendor partners. It was one designed to meet the needs of people who are aging, decreased vision, decreased hearing, the need for things that are not just graphics or icons, but text-based, things along those lines. We talked to people who are older to find out what they needed. When we offered the product, it then became one of Oprah Winfrey's top 10 gifts under $100. Not for people who are aging, not for people with mild hearing loss or vision loss, but for the whole population. So if you have the attitude of universal design or design for all, you can make products and services that are accessible, you can make things that are forward-thinking, and still address the needs of the vast majority of people with disabilities. Now, in some cases, there are specialized needs, and that's where a global market becomes absolutely wonderful. We at AT&T were able to work with a Code Factory, which is a company in Spain. They are experts in user interface for people who are blind. And we were able to offer our customers in the United States access to basically all our Android, our blind customers in the United States, access to all our Android platform products because of that partnership. So again, it's that communication, the outreach, and the bridging that is so critical. So I would say if you go away from this conference today, dedicate yourself toward access regardless of where you come from, and keep in mind that when you're making decisions, it should be nothing without us, nothing about us without us. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Paul, that was excellent.
All right, good. Paul Schrader, American Foundation for the Blind. Thank you very much. Karen, it's great to be on this panel with you. And yes, we have worked together for many years. The way you said it, it almost sounded like, gosh, too many years with these folks. But I know you've enjoyed every one of them, as have we.
Every minute, Paul. I'm just trying not to show our ages.
So I want to touch on 4 points, and hopefully I'll remember all 4 of them. The first one is TV access. One of the things that we found in the work to pass the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, CVAA, is that video description became a real touch point of controversy. And so I think one of the things that all of us need to recall is that TV access sort of occupies this difficult strata for the disability community. And I think one of the reasons why video description became such a cause célèbre, a problem in the enactment of the 21st Century Bill, is that I think the blindness community is still uncertain about whether in fact we need it and want it. And I think that's a difficult truth that advocates need to contend with. It's what I would call the I don't need it syndrome, because a number of us in the advocacy community are sort of disinterested in television, dismiss it as unimportant, and yet, as we just heard earlier this morning, it's in virtually all households in the developed world and a good number of households in the developing world. There's a reason why television is so important. Bottom line, like it or not, it is what aligns us with the cultural norms of our society. And if people with disabilities don't have access to that programming, they are behind, they are isolated from those cultural norms. So you cannot like TV, and there's a lot about it that I don't like. Doesn't matter. We need to have access to it because that's where people are. And if people are there, if people are watching and are participating, there's a reason for that. And we need to be accessing that right alongside. Frankly, 4 hours a week is pretty disgraceful. but it's all we could get. Hopefully we'll get to a point where video description, like captioning, becomes something that everybody actually wants to have in a commonplace environment. TV controls, accessibility to the TV equipment, is also an important topic that has gotten too little attention, and I'm glad it's included in the new law. I also compliment the World Blind Union for its work in putting TV accessibility forward. Hopefully on the next panel that might get mentioned. So you can find information about how to make TV accessible in a delightful paper on the World Blind Union's organization website. A couple other points. I call this the joy of something. Too often, industry sort of talks to people with disabilities, and they kind of do this. Wouldn't it be great if we could give you this or that access feature? So, for example, in the blindness community, we are constantly told, wouldn't it be great if you could speak to your phone and it would do all the things you want to do? No, actually, it wouldn't be great. What would be great is if we could have access to all the information on the screen in the form that we find most usable as text output, speech output rather, from the text, that we could have full control over. Do some people like to have voice control? Sure they do, just as some sighted people do. But it is not the common way of accessing the information. It is often not the most efficient way of controlling a device, and most of the time it is not done all that well. So we find this situation where people with disabilities are sort of given a half solution to something they've never had before. And sure, do they think it's great? Yeah, it's better than what we had. It's the joy of something. But it is not enough. And no longer, I think, can we settle for the joy of something. In some ways, Apple, which we compliment a lot as for its innovation in so many areas, but certainly in accessibility, has done us a little bit of harm, because I think it's taken the pressure off the rest of industry to go one better. Because now people can choose the iPhone or the iPad or iPod and have access built right in, and the rest of industry has not come close to meeting that, to hitting that gap, to filling that gap. Gaps remain in the technology laws. Third point I want to just quickly touch on. Partly this is because technology access, in my view, remains still a little bit of a secondary priority for many of us in the advocacy disability community. That needs to change. Also because the jurisdiction of our laws, certainly in the U.S., are not quite up to the task. For example, our laws require access to education in the workplace through accommodations of individuals, but technology solutions need to be built broader than that. So an individual accommodation often is not sufficient to make the change. We've heard a little bit about Section 508, which requires government procurement of accessible technology. Great. The problem is that there's so many exemptions in that law, and it only requires government to buy accessible technology that essentially exists. If it doesn't exist, we're not going to achieve accessibility. There's also the tortoise and hare problem, as I like to say, and that's, you know, sort of summed up in the fact that the 21st century CVAA passes 10 years into the 21st century. We're always a little bit behind on technology access, and so that is compounded by this policy problem. Last point, and I'll end here, meaningful enforcement. It doesn't end, the passage of a law does not change anything, and it certainly doesn't change anything if we don't have an agency that will enforce the requirements of the law. And frankly, we can gripe all we want about this or that government agency and whether or not it enforced a law, but if we're not demanding it as consumers and as organizations that support consumers with disabilities, then enforcement won't happen. It's an iron law. If we don't push for it, agencies aren't going to do it on their own. And so when we get laws like the CVAA or Section 255 enacted, it does no good to gripe about what the Federal Communications Commission does or does not do. What we need to do is demand for them to take the enforcement action required in the law and to not be timid about pushing industry to do what it's supposed to do as required in the law. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Paul, for those insightful remarks. Claude?
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all here today. First of all, I'd like to commend Karen. Karen, along with all the staff of the FCC, for the wonderful job that they've been doing over the last few years in beginning the process of implementing the CVAA. And of course, by CVAA, I mean the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. The very swift implementation process that we've seen over the last 2 years is unheard of historically. Considering the example of the ADA in the 1990s, it took a good 3 or 4 years to begin the implementation, but not so with the CVAA here. For example, Internet Protocol Closed Captioning, IP captioning, has a schedule for implementation that will be over a 16-month period. The disability community and the deaf and hard of hearing community in particular is excited to see such an aggressive schedule from this legislation. Industry has been doing a great job of partnering with consumer groups along with the FCC to make sure that we can reach these goals. Without the cooperation of industry along with the FCC and consumers, we could not have gotten this legislation passed in the first place. I also want to, of course, thank Congress for passing the CVAA. Some of the congressmen and senators there have deaf family members or deaf relatives, or have deaf people as their neighbors, or attended school with deaf people, with blind people, and they feel a strong relationship with the disability community. This legislation was passed with a huge amount of bipartisan support from both the left and the right in the House and the Senate. I want to emphasize my support about Karen's remarks and our earlier remarks from this morning, that access is a civil right. Communication access is a civil right. Deaf and hard of hearing populations really depend on access, because access means communication, communication means information, and with information we won't be left behind. We can make sure we're keeping up with society from day to day. For deaf and hard of hearing people, we don't have access to information in the environment 24/7. Some do, but many don't. So while the majority of the population, the hearing population, is being stimulated by auditory information every day, we're not able to hear you. We have to only get access to that information that you're able to get incidentally through specific communication channels. Not through our ears, but through our eyes and through our technological devices. I want to emphasize that some of us have spoken about the disability community as 1/7 of the American population. I'd also like to propose that in other countries, we please look at the disability community as a market, as a power to be reckoned with, and that industry should begin to think about opportunities to market products and services specifically to the disability community. You have a good market in us. I'd also like to commend the FCC and COAT for the changes that we've seen with technology that have required us to go back to Congress to work on the CVAA. For example, as Karen mentioned earlier, historically we've only been able to access 911 services through TTYs. We've seen a number of Americans here, particularly deaf and hard of hearing Americans and young people now, whose TTY equivalent is actually a mobile device or a computer, and that technology is not compatible with the TTY emergency services requirements of yore. There's no way for people to use those new devices to contact emergency services. We're very pleased with the CVAA's support for new accommodations there, particularly for next generation 911 services that'll make it possible for us to make emergency calls through video, text, voice, or a combination of two or more of those. Captioning is also a great victory for us on the CVAA. We've had access on the television for broadcast, but now moving those programs from broadcast mediums to online mediums. We're really excited to see the same captioning access provided there. We're also excited that not only do we have access to captions in our homes, but as we move throughout the world with our mobile devices, throughout our daily commute, on our train ride into work and back home, we can have access to accessible programs with captioning through the requirements of the CVAA. And I want to thank the FCC and COAT for making that possible. Captions, whether on broadcast, television, or on the internet, will improve literacy for the general population. When I was a little boy, I knew 5 words at age 5. I went to school for the deaf. But now we're going to see that deaf and hard of hearing children here are going to have access to written English words from the time they're very young. And compared to my vocabulary at 5, a young deaf or hard of hearing child now may know 20 or 30,000 words and can develop language much earlier than those of my generation. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank the government and policymakers as well as industry for working in collaboration with us to make this happen. Again, I can't emphasize enough how much I want to commend industry, government, and consumer groups for all working together. And I'd like to advise those of you here from other countries that if you are looking to work with consumer groups, try to do so in collaboration with industry as part of a coalition. Bring those consumer groups together in an organization like COAT. Before we filed comments with the FCC, our consumer groups would come together to agree, and we did not always agree in the beginning, but we eventually came to a point of agreement before we made our filing with a coalition of voices, which made the whole process much smoother. The FCC was able to accept our comments much easier, considering that we had already gone through the process of deliberation. We don't always win on every point, but most of the time we did because of the process we went through and the coalition we were a part of in the collaborative decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. I appreciate especially the remarks about the collaboration. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about that as well. And the last speaker, but not least, is Jennifer Simpson.
Good morning, everybody. I am Jennifer Simpson. I'm right now a volunteer for the Coalition of Organizations for Accessible Technology. I'm also happy to be here again at the FCC. I used to work here, but now I'm sitting at the desk where the commissioners usually sit, so it's kind of an interesting position to be in. I just have a few points to make. My colleagues, who I highly esteem and know far more than I do most of the time, have made many very critical points. I'm going to make about 4 or 5 points that I think we should always bear in mind as we sort of move forward with this overall arching agenda, which is making everything accessible right from the start for everybody. I think the need for statutes and regulations has been mentioned several times. I know there's a lot of discussion about how there are market forces, and sometimes others need to be taking care of this. But the truth of the matter is, as my colleagues have mentioned, disability is a diverse marketplace, and it is going to require statutes and regulations, and that's at the global level. I'm also talking that way. This is not as long as people are still out there saying that accessibility is an innovation killer, well, then we're going to need statutes and regulations. Until no one's saying that, we cannot give up this fight. The other point I want to make, excuse me, is from the coalition point of view, it is coalitions that get things done. We've heard a lot about how Congress passed laws, and thank you very much, Congress, for doing that. But the truth of the matter is, it is people with disabilities that made these changes happen. And they always did it working together and in coalition. The COAT Coalition, for instance, was cross-disability. We were deaf groups, we were blind groups, we were deaf-blind groups, we were hard-of-hearing groups, we were low-vision groups. We were international groups, we were autistic groups, we were groups of people with physical disabilities. When we first started the coalition, and Karen and I were the co-founders, within within a month of talking about the agenda that we envisioned, the changes we envisioned, we had over 30 organizations say, this is so important, this is so critical that this happens, that we get together and we work on this issue. And I want to underscore how important that particular movement was when we started off, that right away everyone said, gee, yeah, we feel like we're being left behind, we don't know what's going on, we want to be involved. So the Code Coalition kind of became the vehicle and the instrument for many of those hopes and aspirations that were in our community, that people wanted to use the new stuff and have it work for them, and have it work for them for the things that everybody uses these things for every day. We also had taken the long view. Karen says we're old. We are old. I celebrated my 60th birthday this week. Yay. 60s. 50 was nifty, but 60, I don't know. I haven't figured that one out. Anyway, we also took the long view as disability advocates. We weren't sure when it was going to happen, how it was going to happen, but we never gave up the idea that the accessibility that we wanted was going to happen. And I think that is something that the international community of people with disabilities can certainly benefit from that insight if they haven't already. The fact that you keep struggling and fighting for something very specific, and sometimes you get what you want and sometimes you don't, but you don't give up. You don't go away. You don't stop knocking on doors. You don't stop making the arguments, and you don't stop doing what you know is right, because it is right, because disability affects everyone anywhere at any time. I mentioned how critical it is that people with disabilities are involved at all levels, but I also want to talk about the role of other people, which has been mentioned here as well. And that means engagement by individuals with disabilities with people at individual companies, with trade associations, with standards bodies. And that means those people in those entities need to make sure that they engage people with disabilities in those activities. Because without that engagement and those ongoing conversations, none of us are going to be able to understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And we all know what the goal is. The ideal is that everything works out of the box and is accessible and usable. Enforcement has been mentioned here, and I think that's very, very important. A lot of, I think, stuff could be said about accessibility at the international level and at the global level, but truly it is going to be whether individual governments, whether individual bodies actually carry forward this notion and do, in fact, prosecute in some cases, or investigate, or penalize people that don't do it right. I mean, this makes a lot of people uncomfortable, I know, but this is, in fact, in some cases, what has to happen, because we're serious, and this is serious stuff we're talking about. We're not talking about just doing the right thing. We're talking about doing stuff that actually means people have access and can get to their jobs, or find out about something, or, as Claude so eloquently mentioned, having more than 30 words vocabulary. So this is very important stuff, and we can never let go of the fact that how important this is. The other thing that the Code Coalition did was always it stayed very flexible. We did compromise in some cases on what we wanted. We didn't get everything we wanted. There were many things we did want. We did start out with the idea that captioning of everything on the internet was what was needed. Video description, should be more than 4 hours per TV channel a week. But we took a major step forward, I think, with both of what we did get. But that means that we still have much work to do, and I think that is something that we're going to have to look at. And also, there's always new technologies coming out. I mean, the world is wireless now, which means that I can connect anywhere at any time. I grew up in England. We had a wireline phone that we shared with some neighbors, with a 3-digit thing, and that would two rings would mean it was my house, and 3 rings meant it was the neighbor's house. So. But today, in my car driving up to Philadelphia, my stepson can call me via a wireless phone from Amsterdam and have a conversation with us, and it's really cheap To make an international call when I was a kid, you had to book it. I mean, the time has really changed, and I think this change is going to continue. If that's how far and how fast we now are, just imagine where we're going to be 50 years from now. So there is plenty of work to be done to make sure that in that next 50 years, as the internet and as wireless and as other new technologies emerge, that we do go forward, making sure that they are accessible and usable. I think that's all the points I had to make, and thank you very much.
Thank you all. I wanted to mention also that we're very excited. All of your presentations were stupendous. I wanted to mention also something that somebody pointed out to me. I mentioned before that we have an accessibility clearinghouse, and I just learned last night that this clearinghouse, which has in it accessible products and services that you can find, it was based on the Mobile Manufacturer Forum creating a machine-readable data feed of their GARI database, G-A-R-I database, which has information on accessibility features of hundreds of mobile phones. And I learned last night that the Fundación Vodafone Spain developers have prototyped a mobile version of the GARI data in a mobile app that runs on feature phones, and it uses, this is kind of technical, but I'm reading, it uses a prototype accessibility framework built on the Java Micro Edition environment from Oracle, which includes a number of features, including a prototype screen developer. The reason that I'm mentioning this is that it just shows you what can happen when one part of the world does something and it ripples elsewhere, and it basically will allow a screen reader on an inexpensive mobile device helping you pick out your next mobile phone. So one of the people here, our actually Chief of Technology Officer Greg Ellen, pointed this out to me, and I wanted to share it with you because I know that there will be a major Vodafone presentation later on. Also, is Elizabeth Lyle in the room still? She may have left, but I wanted to recognize her as well. She was the one of the founders of the Accessibility and Innovation Initiative. We have just about 3 or 4 minutes for a couple of questions. Are there any? Is there anybody brave enough to ask any questions at this point? There's a question back there. Yes. Is there a mic? Yes. Here it comes.
Thanks. Gary Morin with the National Institutes of Health. 2 quick, or maybe not quick, questions. One in terms of internet access for people with dexterity impairments, as we see in the CVAA, access for people with hearing loss, vision loss, videos on the FCC website, videos on other websites, I can't access using speech recognition software. So there's a whole population that keeps getting left out. Doesn't matter how good the accessibility is of a video if you can't turn it on. So does CVAA address that at all?
Want to take this?
And then question for Claude in particular, captioning. We're getting better about quantity, but we're still not there. Quality of captioning. The more I watch television and films with captioning, the worse I see it is. Not just the words, but everything behind the words. And just reading some research now out of Texas, I think, on looking at the whole environment, all the background information that's not coming across, voice intonation, voice intention of sound, of speech. The words aren't enough of what's in the captions. What's being done to push the quality of captioning so that it's not just words that are flat across the screen without meaning behind it?
So the answer, thank you. The answer to your first question is that the CVAA does cover dexterity access for the purposes of advanced communication services. So the Title I would be yes. For Title II, video programming, one of the compromises was that right now the user interfaces only have to be accessible to people who are blind and visually impaired. And as Jennifer said, there were lots of cuts in the law, and that was unfortunately one of the cuts. Let me turn it over to Claude for the answer about closed captioning.
You make an excellent point, and consumer groups are filing a petition for caption quality. We filed one back in 2004, and we're working now with Karen and other staff here at the FCC and others at the Disability Rights Office specifically. So you should be hearing with the FCC within 1 or 2 years on developing the technical standards for the quality of captioning, which will then have an impact on the internet TV captions as well. And we're willing to take a back seat for a while as we're implementing CVAA. There are so many other important initiatives going on with that legislation with regards to relay services and so forth. So the FCC is going to be working with us on that issue very soon.
And I can confirm that. We are working on it. We're actively working on it, but as Claude said, we have a lot of deadlines that Congress gave to us on the CVAA, and so we need to address those first. Any other questions?
Just a very quick point, if I could.
Yes.
Thanks. Paul Schrader. Just quickly, pay attention to the assistive technology stuff. There was a lot in the Communications and Video Accessibility Act on that point, on where assistive technology should be used, where industry should build to standards or protocols used by assistive technology, the application program interface issue. We don't have time to go into it here. Hopefully it'll be discussed in other sessions, but I think this is one of these really key issues, is how do we deal with the legacy, the design of assistive tech, the design of built-in accessibility. Where do those things cross? How do we make sure that accessibility is being addressed? And I think the questioner, sort of hit on some of the key challenges in that environment.
I think we have time for one more question right in the front row. And be aware that we will all be, well, most of us will be at the Gaylord for the rest of the conference, so you can nab us and ask for additional questions. But one more question right in the front.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jerry Ellis. I'm here from Dublin in Ireland, and just thanks for the opportunity to be here. Really a piece of information which I hope will be of use rather than a question. We have a number of key people who we have to influence: legislators, policymakers, the people with their hands on the finances within industry itself, and a lot of those are being covered. But one group that often are not very well covered are the actual designers themselves, because you find that designers, when they learn how to use Java, as was mentioned earlier, or mobile devices, or when they're designing that, they don't know about universal design. They don't know about including our needs. They may, even if you convince them that it's a great idea, they don't know how to do it. A group of us in Europe got together about 3 years ago and worked with CEN, which is the one of the 3 main European standards bodies, and we worked out what was called a workshop agreement. So this is now an official document from the official standards bodies in Europe, and was developed by with input from around 200 inputs from around Europe. There is now a workshop agreement for teaching universal design in the area of ICT. And the idea is that this is a curriculum, so you can take this to your local university, build a course of universal design for designers, and that is available for free. It's usually you have to pay for these workshop agreements, but that is now available for free in accessible PDF from the CEN website. My name is Jerry Ellis. I'll be around for the 2 to 3 days of the summit and the meeting back here on Wednesday, and if anyone wants to find out more, I'd be delighted to pass on that information. You can pass it on to your industry and to your colleges and mainstream courses. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful to know. Well, I think we're going to wrap up the panel because we have a very busy day. Thank you again for your attention to these these presentations, and thank you again to all of the panelists for your excellent presentations.
Good morning and welcome back. Let me just remind you to refrain from using Flash, because one of the presenters is allergic to that, so I'll please remind you not to use Flash during this session. I would like to again welcome you back to this session. And thanks to Karen and all the respondents for giving a clear explanation of the background and scope of the new legislation currently implemented in the United States, the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act. While the United States have historically been at the forefront of legislation to protect the rights of persons with disabilities, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has been ratified by 106 countries, where it is now enforceable, with its Article 9 specifically addressing the obligation to provide accessible information and communication technologies. The Convention creates the opportunity for all stakeholders involved in mobile technology and services to take a closer look at what is required and how to best leverage new mobile technologies and applications for persons with disabilities. Making sure that all stakeholders are involved in this process is essential, as the previous panel has demonstrated. Today, I'm particularly pleased to chair this panel of distinguished speakers coming from various horizons and with intimate knowledge of the most challenging and promising areas of policies and programs for accessible and assistive mobile services for persons with disabilities. Let me introduce our panelists. Fred Dulton, Social Affairs Officer, United Nations Secretariat for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Marie-Louise Hayward, Social and Consumer Policy, CRTC, Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunication Commission. Fosa Mashamgoane, General Manager, Consumer Affairs, Independent Communication Authority from South Africa. Judy Brewer, Director, Web Accessibility Initiative, W3C. Stephen King, President-elect Daisy Corporation. Fuad Hassoun, CEO, Dialogue Accessibilities. And last but not least, Archana Gulati, Joint Administrators, Universal Service Obligation Fund, Department of Telecommunication, Ministry of Communications and IT in India. Now, let me turn to our first panelist, and let's get started by an update on the extraordinary rate of adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and how it impacts all of us. Fred Dulton, Social Affairs Officer, United Nations Secretariat for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, will give us now the latest update and an overview of its implications for mobile stakeholders and regulators. Each of the panelists will have a 5 to 6 minutes statement, and then we'll go on question and answers. If you don't have questions, I will have some questions for you guys. So be prepared. Fred, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Turi. Excuse me if I speak a little fast. There was no distinction between the caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee. I'm honored to be here today sharing the same podium as a distinguished panelists and moderators, as well as you all here, who have long championed the inclusion of persons with disabilities in society and development. I would like to thank G3ICT for inviting the Secretariat for the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs to present at this summit. As the global UN focal point on disability, we work with governments, the UN system, civil society organizations, including organizations of persons with disabilities, academic institutions, and other stakeholders to develop normative standards and policy frameworks to promote the rights of persons with disabilities and disability inclusive development. As our office was directly involved with the launch of G3ICT in 2006, we are happy to see it develop and firmly establish itself as a leader in promoting the international digital accessibility agenda that furthers the implementation of the convention, also known as the CRPD. Thank you, Axel. This enabling summit is being held at a prime moment in time when the CRPD in its first 5 years has achieved remarkable and significant success, as currently 107 countries have ratified and are states party to it, with Indonesia depositing its instrument of ratification late last week. These countries must undertake measures to develop institutions, implement new disability policies and programs, modify or draft new legislation to comply with the provisions of this legally binding treaty. This also directly impacts national regulations and the development of accessibility policies and programs related to information and communications technologies. Each year at UN headquarters, the Conference of States Parties to the Convention meets to review and discuss the implementation of the Convention. At this year's conference in September, we had over 600 delegates participate, including ministerial level attendees and civil society organizations. We had a record number of side events to the conference with over 40 events over a 2.5-day period. The conference is becoming the largest and widest global international meeting on disability. For this conference, we collect information from governments on their efforts in progress in implementing the convention. Information received includes new measures, legislations, institutions, and changes in the national disability policy infrastructure, which includes developments in ICT for greater inclusion of persons with disabilities. This compilation is updated each year and is available on our website. We will be posting an expanded version of this statement along with links to these resources. Last year, G3ICT published the CRPD Progress Report on ICT accessibility, which shows that the accessibility provisions of the Convention covering ICTs are progressively translated into laws and regulations by ratifying countries. I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Convention. Although the accessibility dispositions of the Convention have been put into a wonderful monograph by Cynthia Waddell and Betty Dion of the Gates Foundation, and that's available on our website. The Convention, right off the bat, from its preamble, talks about disability and accessibility, that disability is an evolving concept and results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. It also provides definitions for key concepts, including communication and universal accessibility. Now, we've heard about the Article 9 on accessibility, which is fundamental to the realization of many other rights articulated in the Convention. I don't know if Mohammed Taravni is here, but I think he really articulated this by saying that it is the backbone of the Convention, the spinal cord of the Convention. Then there are more issues on different articles. Last year, in collaboration with the World Bank, we had an expert group meeting on accessibility entitled Innovative and Cost-Effective Approaches for Inclusive and Accessible Development. Among the many issues discussed, the experts recommended options for the development of ICTs and assistive technologies at an affordable cost, as called for in the Convention. They highlighted key steps in developing accessible ICT policies and provide guidance on national coordination mechanisms, support and implementation of ICT standards, including the use of high-impact proven solutions and the potential of mobile-based assistive solutions to help realize these objectives. Now, older persons also benefit from several provisions in the Convention related to accessibility in Article 9 and Article 20 on personal mobility. Now, last year an open-ended working group on aging was established by the UN General Assembly to consider the existing international normative framework on the human rights of older persons. Translated, this means that we could possibly be looking at a convention on the rights of older persons in the coming years. In conclusion, last month the Third Committee of the General Assembly adopted a resolution that has laid out plans for a high-level meeting on disability in 2013 at the United Nations in New York, with the view to strengthening efforts to ensure accessibility and the inclusion of persons with disabilities in all aspects of development efforts. The high-level meeting will possibly be at the level of heads of state. And let me conclude on a different note and tell you about two recent mobile apps related to the work of the United Nations. Last year, the UN Procurement Division launched a free new app to enable businesses to work with the UN worldwide. It's the largest buying resource for the UN system, and the UN Procurement app offers real-time access to information related to business opportunities and strategic sourcing, such as requests for expression of interest, future projects, business seminars, tenders, bids, and contract awards. The buying also includes equipment and services, consultation and training related to ICTs. It further provides contact information for UN buyers. And the other app was launched by Stevie Wonder, the UN Messenger of Peace. The app has daily news and content from the UN. It's part of a broader effort by the UN to use different technologies and formats to reach the over 5 to 6 billion people that have access to mobile phones worldwide. The enjoyment of human rights by all members of society, including the full participation of persons with disabilities and older persons, goes to the very heart of our mission at the United Nations, to build a safe, just, and equitable society for all. I look forward to an informative and productive meeting. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Fred. Thank you again. This is one of the reasons why I feel very proud of being part of the United Nations. There are really very many good things that are happening, and under the leadership of Mr. Ban Ki-moon, we're trying to act as one, all agencies working together, and it's very important to share best practices and even share mistakes that have been made, so that no one has to make mistakes that have been made already. So thank you very much again, Fred. Our next speaker is Marie-Louise Hayward. She will share with us the perspective of a regulator which has already implemented a number of dispositions promoting the accessibility of telecommunications and of mobile services in particular. So we are very interested to learn more about the practical issues and success factors identified in the context of the Canadian experience. Marie-Louise, you have the floor.
All right, thank you for that. As I've already been introduced, I'm with the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, and we too are very fond of acronyms as well. So the CRTC is the Canadian counterpart to the FCC in the United States. So, as already referenced, the CRTC does have an accessibility framework that promotes the accessibility of mobile wireless services for persons with disabilities. I will share that with you today, and also some of our experiences in implementing that policy. And then I will conclude with some of the opportunities and challenges for developers of mobile applications that promote accessibility. And of course, I look forward to sharing the experiences of others. The CRTC's mandate is derived from two Canadian acts, actually, the Telecommunications Act and the Broadcasting Act. Both of these acts contain objectives that pertain to accessibility, and these reflect the principle that access to communications is critical to full participation and integration into society, as well as an important component of public safety. So as a policymaker, the CRTC must balance the needs of persons with disabilities with the other objectives in the Act. And some of these objectives include things like technical considerations or financial considerations, those kinds of things. The CRTC uses Canadian human rights principles that recognize that equality is a fundamental value and a central component of the public interest. So about the accessibility policy, it was established in 2009, and it included a public review. And in that public review, evidence and argument was provided by persons with disabilities. And during that review, the CRTC became aware of the lack of available mobile wireless devices acutely for persons who are blind, and for those who have moderate to severe mobility and cognitive disabilities. So in that, the CRTC requested in its policy that all wireless service providers offer and maintain at least one type of wireless mobile handset that will provide access to wireless services by these people. The CRTC also stated that it would consider imposing a condition on the offer of the provision of a wireless service, requiring that the wireless providers offer such handsets. There are two other components that were stressed in the policy, much of what we've heard today about consultation and speaking with the people, the stakeholders themselves. The service providers are to consult with parties representing persons with disabilities, and the other component has to do with life cycle support to maintain reasonable support for assistive technologies that a number of these people really rely upon. The policy is light-handed in its regulatory approach. It's flexible, it's technologically neutral, and looks to the industry participants to find solutions in consultation with accessibility communities. So in Canada, we are experiencing the same uptake in mobile wireless services as most other countries are, and the mobile platform is becoming the preferred platform, and thus access to the services on these devices is vital. So from a Commission point of view, we as staff have been busy hands-on addressing the complaints and working with parties for resolution on issues that they've encountered in accessibility. Most of these complaints are from people who are blind and from people with severe mobility disabilities. And the complaints typically pertain to the lack of accessibility of the user interface. Addressing these complaints then highlighted to us that we had to have a need for research and greater domain expertise for both ourselves and the Commission and for our industry. In the latter part of 2010, we commissioned an independent study from the Inclusive Design Research Centre of OCAD University in Toronto, Canada. The IDRC is a leading research and development centre with expertise in inclusiveness of emerging technology, information and practices. The report was released early in 2011 and is an assessment of the mobile devices, smartphones and feature phones offered in the Canadian marketplace in terms of how they address the accessibility needs of the person specified in the accessibility policy. And its findings indicate that the late 2010 Canadian market for mobile solutions for these people was mixed. There are accessible devices for persons who are blind, but they're not available from all service providers. And overall, there's a lack of accessible devices with persons with severe mobility or cognitive disabilities. The report also highlights high-level assessment of the functional needs and preferences and types of solutions that address these. Accessibility is approached holistically, out of the box, rather than as a set of discrete accessibility features. And overall, the report is a useful tool, a proxy for consultation with persons with disabilities, and a jumping off point for further discussions on needs and solutions. So now that we have the report, how are we leveraging it? Our Canadian counterpart to the CTIA in the United States is the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association, the CWTA. The CRTC has asked the CWTA to address the gaps identified in the OCAD report and come back to the Commission with its progress. And we know the CWTA has a number of initiatives underway, some of which are going to be announced shortly. The CWTA also has some initiatives of its own for accessibility. In the fall, it hosted a wireless technology showcase event that featured accessibility as one of 4 thematic pillars. This well-attended event profiled innovators in accessibility, including Nokia and Komodo Open Labs. Nokia, everyone's familiar with them. They've historically had a strong presence in products that promote accessibility. Komodo Open Labs is a Canadian not-just-for-profit corporation that commercializes open and inclusive technologies. So events and initiatives such as these really emphasize how industry relationships are beneficial in stimulating awareness and are helpful in effectively implementing policy. The challenges and opportunities. Well, smartphones have more smarts, their openness and flexibility in their architectures, and this represents an opportunity for developers of new third-party applications that make smartphones accessible. However, there are challenges. Developers encounter challenges in maintaining the stability of accessible applications in a dynamic and disruptive environment of rapid churn. When manufacturers of cell phones or of smartphones upgrade mobile platforms, changes may be inadvertently introduced that can compromise the accessibility of the overall device. Another challenge they're encountering is the fragmentation of the traditional supply market, the supply models. Developers are challenged with integrating into the chain, and this can mean collaboration with manufacturers of platforms and influencing wireless product providers to integrate and offer their accessibility solutions as tested and out of the box. And here developers may encounter reluctance or inertias. And then lastly, developers may be confronted with misconceptions that to a large extent, a lot of these accessibility capabilities are commercially available and ready to be integrated. There's a tendency to think of them as one-ofs, and that's not necessarily the case. But in spite of these challenges, the opportunity to innovate is clearly here, to set in motion a paradigm that drives new products and services beyond those envisioned. And innovation to improve accessibility benefits persons with disabilities and everybody else. So just to conclude, we are aware of all the numerous challenges, and we recognize that they're not unique to Canada, but we are continuing to watch the current developments in accessibility domestically and internationally.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie-Louise. Marie-Louise is from CRTC, the Canadian regulator. We're in the FCC building here. There's always debate about who is the oldest regulator in the world. But since we are in their building, you probably let them be the oldest. For one time, old doesn't mean necessarily bad thing, since you are dealing with new things actually, so new issues. But I'm really happy to hear you mentioning one keyword, a light-handed regulation, which is very important. That in the ITU circles, we try to avoid heavy-handed regulation, and this is very important. And but we were very pleased to see your experience in how you are embedding these new policies in the regulatory framework in Canada. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Fosa Mashangwane, is the General Manager of Consumer Affairs Independent Communication Authority, South Africa. Will describe the challenges and opportunities that he faces in matters of mobile accessibility as telecom regulator of one of the most advanced developing countries in matter of human rights policies and programs. I know that you just hosted the World Assembly of Disabled People International, and that you also were one of the very first governments in the world to offer a web portal dedicated specifically to persons with disabilities. For that, you have the floor.
Thank you, Program Director. The Secretary General of the ITU, Dr. Tore, the Associate Director of the White House, Mr. Dale, the Chairperson of the FCC, Mr. Kenowski, FCC Commissioners, Executive Management and staff of the FCC, the leadership of 3G ICT, Mr. Axel Lebowski in particular, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today in the US at the FCC representing the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, which is the equivalent of the FCC in South Africa. And I am conveying the greetings of our chairperson, Dr. Stephen Ncube, his fellow councillors, and my colleagues in the executive management, to the FCC leadership, 3G ICT leadership, and to the ITU leadership. Program Director, let me start off by mentioning that working with and working for persons with disabilities is very close to my heart. So I am going to make a presentation and I'll go through it quickly because I noticed that there's no more time, and then so some of the information I will just leave it. Otherwise my presentation is available if it is needed. So presentation, please. What you see there is our country, South Africa. It is the youngest democracy. I think it's the youngest democracy amongst all the people gathered here. We are 17 years in our democracy. And after our democracy, we have worked very hard to make sure that some of the legislation that need to promote the rights of persons with disability are worked on. So South Africa have got a population of about 44.8 million. We have got about 5% people living with disabilities, and those that have physical disability are about 30%. Sight disability is 32%. Hearing disability is 20%. Emotional disability is 16%. Intellectual disability is 12%. and those that have got a communication disability about 7%. So our parliament, which is where the laws are made, have made sure that our constitution should be the supreme law of the republic. And then so chapter 2 of our constitution guarantees the fundamental rights of all the citizens of South Africa. And the disabled people are guaranteed the right to be treated equally and enjoy the same rights as all other citizens. So you can see that we are working very hard to make sure that the rights of persons with disability are also taken into the government agenda and also into the agenda of all the organs of state in South Africa. The Independent Communication Authority of South Africa, which is the organization I'm representing, has been established by the Act of Parliament, and then it has been there for the past 11 years. So we have been in existence from 2000, and then now we are 11 years in existence. So you can just imagine that being 11 years into existence, there's a lot of work that needs to be happen, more especially to change all the laws that have been skewed towards the persons with disability. So as you can see, this is our vision and our mission, and our mandate as the ICASA is to regulate communication in the interest of the public. So we know that regulators make regulations, and then so I'll just mention that as a regulator, we are responsible to promote competition in the ICT market, and we're also there to protect consumers. And then we do that by having the code on people's disability. This is one of the code that we use to make sure that the licensees or the operators that are licensed by ICASA make sure that the rights and interests of persons with disability are protected and promoted. So broadcasting service must make sure that their services should be accessible to people with disabilities, and their content must be should not be stereotyped to persons with disabilities. And we must also make sure that every year they should report to the authority. So this is one of the measures that we make sure that we hold them accountable, because if they don't report, we'll not show whether they are promoting the rights of persons with disability in their provision of services. The electronic communication services and the electronic communication network services are there in the country to make sure that their services should be accessible to the persons with disabilities. And they must also provide the text phones to the people that are living with disability. And they must also provide the relay system to connect the text phones with voice phone. So you can see that we are trying by all means to make sure that persons with disability can be able to access communication services. And so, as I've mentioned, we are 11 years old, and then there's a lot of work that we need to make sure that the rights of persons with disability are enhanced. So we must make sure that 50% of the public payphones have got hearing aids. This is a big task that is not so easy, because we must make sure that we deploy our staff all over the country to make sure that they assess if the phones do have hearing aids. And then we must also make sure that 50% of the phones should have the counters. So in most cases, you find that the phones or public phones do not have access to the people with disability. They are so high that people who are using the wheelchairs cannot be able to make calls. So this is one of the things that we must make sure that the service providers must make sure that their services are accessible to persons with disabilities. Of course, the ramp is also another area that we need to make sure, because in the past you'll find that the public phones do not have the ramp where the person with the wheelchair can be able to access that phone. So I will just go quickly. The last thing is that the electronic communication service and the electronic communication network services in the country must also provide an annual report to the authorities, so that we can see whether they are meeting the obligation that we have given to them. So we have conducted a study, and this study looked at accessibility by persons with disability in South Africa. And then so in that study, we have looked at those that have got sight challenges, those that have got hearing challenges, those that have got physical challenges, as well as communication. And so in our study for mobile phones, we have found that 57% of the persons with disability have a cell phone. And so the cost was a big problem. As you know, that persons with disability, most of them are not employed, and then so you find that they don't have the money to pay for the subscriptions of their phones. And so almost half of the respondents have experienced a drop cost in our country. So This is the area that we are looking at as the authority to make sure that there's a minimum drop cost in the country, because if there are drop costs, then it means the quality of service is not that good. So I will just go quickly. I will just mention that 24% of the respondents that we have conducted the study in have indicated that they are happy with the standard handset that they are having. But when we talk to them, we also find that there's a need that the manufacturer should make or manufacture the handset that should be user-friendly to them. In terms of the fixed line, 11% of the PWs have access to the landline, and 56% of them can make calls at any time. 39% prefer to make calls off-peak. Why? Because during that time, the calls are very cheap and affordable for PWDs, and 23% of non-fixed line owners will consider getting a fixed line. So in terms of the fixed line, the monthly rentals is a major factor, because in our country the subscription is a little bit high, and so as a result you find that the PWDs are not able to have fixed line payment, and then so that is another thing that we are looking as the authority. We do have public phones, and then overall was that a third of the PWDs have used a public phone, and so people with physical sight or physical or sight disabilities are more likely to use the public access phone in our country, and the community phones are nearly twice as likely to be used by pay phones. So in our country we do have the community phones. These are phones that we have made an obligation to the licensee to say that you must roll out this number of phones throughout the country, more especially in what we used to call the townships, where people did not have phones in the past, so that they as well can also be able to make phone calls. Community saving phones are found to be within a walking distance. So why is because these phones are installed all over at many corners of the townships, so that they can be easily accessible by PWDs. ICASA had a summit this year in March in Johannesburg, and in this summit we wanted to make sure that the regulation that I spoke about earlier on, which is the Code on People with Disability, did yield a good result for access by persons with disability. So in that summit, there were resolutions that were passed, and the first one was that ICASA must work with the South African Bureau of Standards to develop accessibility standards for persons with disabilities. And again, another resolution was that ICASA must develop the intersectoral collaboration in relation to labor and transport. I'm emphasizing this one because in our country we have got the legislation that says government departments, parastatals, and also the private sector should have a certain percentage of people that are working there who have disabilities. Again, the issue of transport is also another area that we are working on, because in the past transport used not to be friendly to or accessible to a person with disability. So we want to make sure that the transport, or more especially the public transport that are there, can be accessed by a person with disability. And then so another resolution was that ICASA should urge the licensees or the operators to broaden the use of South African Sign Language. So sign language is also another area that we have to make sure that it is promoted, because if we don't do that, then people who are not able to hear cannot miss out the information or communication that is vital for their existence. So that is why we emphasize that sign language should also take precedence in all our activities in the country. So we also resolved that ICASA should work together with the organizations of persons with disability to make sure that the equity targets are met. So this is very much important, because in our country we believe that we cannot work alone in isolation and not include the organizations for persons with disability. So that is why, as you can see down there, it is mentioned nothing about us without us. So this is the slogan that is used by our fellow disabled persons in South Africa to say that whatever you do, And for us, you must do it with us. So ICASA has been mandated by the summit to establish a forum which is meant to consult with a person with disability. So this forum is just going to be established early in next year, so that it can be used as a vehicle to make sure that whatever we do as a regulator is done in line with the person with disability. So this is the last but one slide that we have, whereby we have to work with the Consumer Commission, which is the commission that is there to promote and protect the rights of persons in South Africa throughout. I will just go quickly because the time is no more there. The last one is to make sure that we as ICASA must make sure that we address all the issues that has been raised at the summit, and then through that we will be able to achieve our goal, which is to make sure that access by a person with disability is realized in our country. So with these few words, I would like to thank you all, and also the program director.
Thank you, Kosa. Sorry to have interrupted your presentation, very interesting, but the presentation will be made available to participants in any case. So we only have 40 minutes left, and we have 4 speakers. I would like to try and squeeze this and giving at least 10 minutes for presentations. Therefore, I would kindly ask you to limit your presentations to 7 to 8 minutes maximum. One important element to ensure greater mobile accessibility will be standards for mobile websites accessibility, and Judy Brewer, Director of Web Accessibility Initiative, W3C USA, will tell us how she sees the evolution of current web accessibility standards and how they may be expanded to mobile platforms. Again, I will kindly ask you not to use the flashes. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Secretary General. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I'll be giving a brief tour of some work that is some resources that are already existing for mobile accessibility and work that is under development. Mobile accessibility is a vital part of information communication technology accessibility in order that people with disabilities can enjoy full participation in society. And mobile accessibility requires harmonized technology solutions. This includes the need for standards, for best practices, and for supporting techniques, fully cross-disability, and as several speakers in our earlier panel mentioned, from the start. Technologies need to be accessible from the start. And accessibility must be integrated into mainstream standards. There's a place for accessibility standards, but all standards for information communications technology must support accessibility for people with disabilities and older users. There are many players in the field of mobile accessibility and recent developments. I'll be focusing on W3C, World Wide Web Consortium Web Accessibility Initiative work. And sorry, there's a flash from the front row. If you can stop that, please. Thank you. It's an alert light. And also ITU is becoming very involved in accessibility for mobile web, for mobile platform. I am interested to hear about that. Korea has recently published mobile accessibility guidelines. China is involved in that. And so to focus first on World Wide Web Consortium, W3C. W3C is an international vendor-neutral consortium. It develops the standards for the web. It encompasses an expanding range of technology, and it's based, in terms of international, it has 3 main host sites at MIT in North America, at ERSIM, European Research Consortium for Informatics and Mathematics in Europe, and also at Keio University in Japan for outreach to Asia, and we have offices around the world as well. So it hosts the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAY, and this focuses on a number of different areas that are needed to make the web accessible. It includes ensuring technology support in all web standards, developing guidelines and standards as needed that are specific to accessibility, developing evaluation resources for ensuring accessibility, developing education and outreach, coordination with the research program, and standards harmonization. And it's a consensus-based, multi-stakeholder organization involving industry, the disability community, government, and research. And to follow on to Jerry Ellis's comment in the earlier panel, strong involvement of developers, as we're very interested in making sure that accessibility is implemented so that we go past the studying point and actually implement this. It uses an open and community responsive process. For some of our standards, we respond to literally thousands of comments. There are many different ways to participate in W3C, whether one is a W3C member or an invited expert. There's ways to review drafts, and I'm going to keep going at a good pace in respect of the request of the panel. With regard to W3C and WAY, there is an extensive amount of work that already applies to mobile accessibility. If you think of the web space, you can think of an area where there's people who are developing web content, there's the content itself, there are the tools you use to access that content. So the first thing that we look at is accessibility of the information on the web, accessibility of the content on the web. And for that, we have a stable standard with extensive applications to the mobile environment. So that is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. It was completed in 2008. It's widely adopted, implemented, and translated. It has an expanding library of supporting materials and extensive applications to mobile. Producing accessible content, for that we have a standard, a guideline, the authoring tool accessibility guidelines. That's also in a 2.0 version draft. That looks at accessibility of the authoring interface and also production of accessible content. And that is any kind of authoring support, HTML editors, content management systems, blogging, and wiki software. For browsers and media players, we have the user agent accessibility guidelines. And so that includes a number of different support for browsers and media players, along with interoperability with assistive technologies. The accessibility of the technical foundation, all W3C standards are reviewed for accessibility. We have a standard under development, WAY ARIA, for accessible rich internet applications that supports dynamic interactive access. This is critical for mobile web applications so that you can touch, move things around so that you can get the active information there. HTML5 is a standard under development at W3C that you may have heard about. This is the foundation for the open web platform. It is already being used heavily on mobile devices. It's in a last call working draft. We have extensive accessibility work that has been pioneered in this area, not only including ARIA, but also including Canvas for accessible graphics and captioning. There is integrated media accessibility support in HTML5, including onboard captioning. And it's looking like there may be multiple formats that that's supported in. W3C has a suite of mobile web and accessibility resources that has been in existence for several years now. Mobile web best practices is integrated with an accessibility perspective. In addition, the suite includes educational resources on how to make a website accessible, both for people with disabilities and for mobile devices, shared web experiences that are barriers common to mobile device users and people with disabilities, and a mapping of the relationship between mobile web best practices and web content accessibility guidelines. In addition, there are many standards at W3C, which has well over 100 standards altogether. Many of those relate to mobile, such as geolocation, which are location-based services. Those are vital to be accessible to people with disabilities. Work starting on web and TV, moving from an interest group to a working group. Standards on web apps, web applications, including offline web apps. Can you use your mobile phone when you're not connected to the server? Device API and others. Particularly, we have new work starting under advanced work on captioning under a community group on text tracks and time text markup language. And we also have new work starting on Independent User Interface Events, or INDI-UI, and this includes accessible touch, accessible gestural input, and accessible speech input, as well as text. So one of the things that we feel is very important for uptake of accessible mobile standards is harmonization. And it actually accelerates accessibility. You heard Karen's comments earlier this morning in terms of the market force that comes, the market power that comes when there's a unified uptake of standards. And we feel that this is very important. We look forward to the opportunity to collaborate with even more of the people who are present in this very interesting conference this week. And I'll be able to talk a little bit more depth tomorrow if people are interested in some of these specific existing resources and other work that we have under development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Judy, and thank you especially for sticking with the time. Our next speaker is Stephen King, President-elect, Daisy Corporation, who will tell us about how did Daisy Consortium innovated in offering an early on mobile version of its book reader, and how it is now used in several countries by mobile service providers. As you know, Daisy Corporation was the recipient of the ITU's World Information Society Day Award in 2009 in Cairo, when we provided this. At the time, it was Hiroshi Kawamura, president from Daisy Japan, who received the prize. Of course, along with Andrea Sachs who was also awarded. So, Stephen, you have the floor, please.
Okay. Right. Good morning, everybody. You might ask yourself who I am, and as Dr. Toure told you, I'm President-elect of the DAISY Consortium. The DAISY Consortium was set up, and I wrote the original agreement on a napkin in a restaurant in Sweden 15 years ago, and it was set up to develop standards for a better way to read and a better way to publish information that was fully inclusive of people with all disabilities. I'm also the chair of the World Blind Union Technology Working Group. So Paul Schroeder, who spoke this morning, is one of the members of that work group. And we represent the near 300 million people with a visual impairment. That's about 39 million people who are blind, and the rest have low vision across the world, who want access to information and technology as well, and we work on a number of programs. And the thing I'm most proud of at the moment, until I become the president of the DAISY Consortium in January, I am one of the directors of RNIB in the UK, where we work for practical application and access to information. And we started with reading. We've worked on mobile communications, and the thing that we have been working on most recently is television, and just referring to Paul's challenge on television here in the UK. In the UK, 20% of all TV across all the channels that we have has video description, and we also have televisions that talk and give you access to the menu, and there are a number of those TV access services which are coming to market right now, and that comes from working on standards, working cooperatively with industry, and having the long view. So that's who I am, and what I want to do is just talk to you a little bit about the case for global standards and why that's important. So we've got the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and that gets translated into law, but in national environments. But actually, we have a global industry that looks at a market of 7 billion people across the world, and they need things that enable them to address that global market. And actually, that's where standards have come in, and global standards. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of where that has worked. But as president of the DAISY Consortium and with my World Blind Union hat on, I've had the opportunity to travel right across the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and last month in South America. And the thing that I have noticed is that mobile is transforming the world for everybody, but particularly for people with disabilities. In Ethiopia, you might not have any shoes, but you sure have a mobile phone. And you're playing music, and you're using it, and it is the thing that drives inclusion of people with disabilities and real independence. So this is really important stuff. In Korea, you pay for things using a mobile. Also in Ethiopia and Ghana. It's the principal currency. Mobile phone minutes. Really interesting. It's the way you look up and find out things. And it's the way you earn and learn worldwide. So this is really important that we get this right, and we work cooperatively, globally on standards. And we need to pick the best in the world. The best isn't in Europe, the best isn't here in the US. There are great examples right across the world that we need to capture and work on standards to help us deliver those. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the DAISY Consortium because I think it gives an illustration. The DAISY Consortium has developed standards which are being implemented in the e-book revolution that is happening here, I know, in the US, and is definitely happening in the UK. Where now more books are sold as e-books than physical books. The point I want to make is we were there with the right standards at the right time of the development. And so the point I want to draw from that is, for me, standards need to be forward-looking. We need to make sure, we need to talk to our futurologists, we need to understand what's going to happen in the market and start to develop standards that deliver at the right time. Otherwise, as we heard today and this morning, we're always playing catch-up. And catch-up is very expensive for everybody. So the DAISY Consortium, what were the key criteria for success of our work? Well, one was nothing about us without us. We involved and started from a report from the World Blind Union that set out the user requirements for a better way to read. But we also involved industry. So industry were there from the very start, talking to us about, well, how might that be enabled? We're also global. We work with 54 countries. We have over 100 members. And that's not just the developed world, but the developing world. So inclusion of all those aspects of our global society have meant that we can, our standard addresses people who write vertically, people who write from right to left, Hebrew, Hindi, Chinese, 64,000 characters of the Chinese alphabet. So standards must be global and standards must be inclusive. I think, given we're very short of time, I would just talk on how we've then moved that standard into the mainstream publishing industry. Because the mainstream publishing industry started to think about e-books. We started thinking about e-books in 1994 when we started to think about the global digital revolution. But the publishing industry started to think about e-books, I think, in around sort of 2000. But we were there, we engaged them, and the IDPF, the International Digital Publishers Forum, is the forum through which we have engaged with the mainstream publishing industry to help them understand that actually organisations of people with disabilities had something to deliver to them, and they have been adopting very large parts of the DAISY standards into what is now the EPUB standard, and that's been a cooperative piece of work. Just to go back to my theme on we need to be forward-looking. So I told you that in the UK and in Europe now, more than 20% of all TV has video description. That was because we started in 1990. We saw that television was going to go digital. We started the research. We started involving the industry. And by the year 2000, we had legislation for a thing that didn't exist yet, digital television. Digital television came about because by then there were standards and there was regulation that required access services to be included in digital television. And through that partnership with industry and the partnership with the regulator, in the case of the UK Ofcom, we achieved that end. So, forward-looking standards. So, I think my key messages are standards have to be global for economic and practical reasons. We live in a global society. Standards need to work from use cases and cascade through all the layers that you require, from the human interface right through the network and right through to the operating system and the services. They need to be forward-looking. They need to involve people with disabilities, but also industry. And I think my message for organisations of disabled people is we need to get our act together. We need to be able to be really clear what our user requirements are, and we need to think about that in advance, and we need to speak with one voice. And then lastly, I couldn't, because our president, Hiroshi Kawamura, has made a key point of the importance of standards in disaster preparedness. Hiroshi has a fantastic case study on the tsunami where the use of, in our case, the DAISY access to information for people with learning difficulties in Japan. We had done a pilot, and unfortunately the tsunami struck, and it struck the area where that pilot took place, but we also had a control site and the tsunami struck there. And the difference in loss of life was very substantial because people had the information. So for me, we heard talk about the 911 service here in the US, but actually emergency information and emergency preparedness is far beyond that. Actually, I think people with disabilities need access to that information. It should underlie and be one of the key drivers for us to ensure that standards and regulation are in place so that we all have access to hurricane information, tornado information, tsunami information, earthquake information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Our next speaker is Fouad Hassoun, CEO, Media Dialogue, Accessibilities, France and Middle East, who has a personal experience of disability and certainly lead by example in bringing solutions to many mobile service providers in the Middle East. He will tell us how he sees his profession evolve and how, from his standpoint, private and public sectors can better cooperate to serve persons with disabilities. Fouad, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy today to share with you my personal experience, and I will begin telling that I had the chance when I lost my sight. It was in the 86, and at that time the assistive technology came to the blindness community through Braille terminals. And I was one of these users at that time, and I could attend university and continue my studies and apply mathematics and having my PhD in economy thanks to this technology. And after my experience in 10 years in computer science services, we decided in 1996 to go through the right-to-left languages, where we had to implement this technology for people who speaks Arabic, Hebrew, Urdu, Pashtun, etc. And it was a challenge to introduce this technology there. And the experience was that all this population was really interested in discovering this new technology and using it more than we were expecting. And because they have a lot of young also population, and it moves that fast that Medialog becomes today an international group staying a small company. We exist today in Canada with Canadialog, in France, in North Africa, in Middle East, in 14 countries today. Half of our managers are blinds in top management. Not because they are blind, because they are using technology in their daily life, in their job. And the other staff came to them and to ask some help and to ask them some features or some tools to go faster and to be more efficient. Today we are implementing a new solution for the mobile technology. We are collaborating with different players in the industry, with Freedom Scientific, Nuance, and especially with Code Factory, and lately with Capsys, a provider for GPS solutions. We localize these solutions, and we propose them to the users. We talked today about regulation, about standards, etc. But what to do with all this stuff? When we talk about mobile solution or mobile technology, it means that we move. We are going here and there. We go to the FCC, there was no accessibility today here. What the mobile technology offer? Yes, information, communication, etc. But the most important thing that I found myself is that it offers me security. And this is very important. When I feel secure, I feel comfortable, and I can create more and can be more productive on my society. We talk about connection. Yes, click here and you will be connected. Today, we are full connected everywhere. But this technology, if it comes without really usability, with accessibility, but not enough usability, we will be disconnected. I am afraid about this. If we do not continue to support private sector and competition that we can offer best solution for the disabled users, the disabled customers, not only beneficiary, and we protect them. Yes, it's good to put rules, legislations, standards to protect, but consider these are customers. They can create add value. They can create new also technology and new tools and new features for the future. Yes, the gap is very deep. We cannot fill in short time. We can build bridges to cross. If bridges would take long time, let's take a plane and let's go fly over the gap to be connected with each others. Yes, we are in the world of globalization, and the world becomes a village. But it's more easy for blind to live in a big city because he's connected with the others. For me, the most important technology on earth is the human being, and this human being should be full accessible for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Fouad, for this very powerful message. I will now give the floor to our last speaker, Ms. Ashana Gulati, Joint Administrator, Universal Service Obligation Fund, Department of Telecommunications, Ministry, and Communication and IT in India. She will explain to us the potential role of Universal Service Fund in support of accessibility and persons with disabilities. This is a very important topic, since many countries are currently looking at ways of expanding the scope of universal service obligation to persons with disabilities. I understand that all attendees will actually receive a report on this topic, which was jointly published by G3 ICT with the support of ITU. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Dr. Toure. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be a part of this eminent panel and Nobel Summit. I'm grateful to the conference organizers for inviting me and for facilitating my participation. I would like to share with you the very first steps taken by the Universal Service Obligation Fund of the Department of Telecommunications, Ministry of Communications and IT, Government of India in the direction of ensuring accessibility of ICTs to persons with disabilities in rural India. We are all familiar with the concepts of universal access and universal service, in pursuance of which nations across the world have put in place mechanisms to ensure the availability, affordability and accessibility of telecommunication services to their populations, irrespective of whether they reside in rural or urban areas and their paying capacities. The systems and the structures of universal service funds and administrations may differ, but the objectives are consistent across the globe. They arise from an acceptance of the rights of every citizen to have an equal opportunity to participate.
You're speaking too fast for the interpretation.
Sorry, I was in fact
I see
thinking that I was thinking that Fred blamed it on the coffee. I blame it on our Indian genes. You know? Okay,
good.
I'll be speaking slowly. I'll repeat again. The systems and the structures of universal service funds and administrations may differ, but the objectives are consistent across the globe. They arise from an acceptance of the rights of every citizen to have an equal opportunity to participate in the digital world, which has now become the sine qua non for equality of socio-economic and political opportunity. Access to ICTs for the disabled is often included as a part of the legal definition and scope of universal service. This has been done in Australia, various states of the United States of America, and nations in Europe, Africa, and Asia. In India, universal service obligation is legally defined as the obligation to provide access to telecommunication services to people in rural and remote areas at reasonable and affordable prices. In pursuance of this mandate, the Indian USOF has implemented a number of schemes to ensure public access to telecommunications and to promote greater household penetration. These include schemes for shared mobile infrastructure and services, broadband, and shared and open access optical fiber networks. While there is no specific mention of persons with disabilities in the primary and the secondary legislation which govern the scope of activities of the Universal Service Obligation Fund of India, there has been no doubt in our minds that this mandate requires us to ensure that all sections of the target population who on account of their location, income, gender, or various disabilities face unique challenges in accessing ICTs must be provided with access on equal terms. Accordingly, we initiated our program for ICTs for the disabled in October 2010. While taking the preliminary steps towards our program, we were acutely conscious of the fact that India has one of the largest disabled populations in the world. According to the World Bank, the figure would lie between 40 to 80 million. Of these, 50% are illiterate, only 34% employed. Significantly, 75% reside in rural India, which is the focus of the fund's activities. Particularly in rural India, and I quote, "Poverty and disability often form a vicious circle. Poverty many a times becomes a cause of disability due to malnutrition, disease, and lack of access to medical help," unquote. A rural family's efforts towards treatment, rehabilitation, education, assistive aids, etc., can act as a drain on the family's limited resources. The disabled member often remains a non-earning member of the family due to lack of opportunities. The disabled in rural India face many barriers to inclusion. To begin with, they may find it difficult to communicate at all, as in the case of speech or hearing impaired individuals, and to lead lives of self-reliance and dignity. If at all their families and themselves are aware of assistive devices and technologies, and if at all these are available, the costs are likely to be prohibitive. In the absence of the same, they are often deprived of the ability to communicate effectively, to access information and education. Their disability brings in its wake isolation and marginalization. There is another segment of the population which has similar needs. According to our 11th five-year plan document, the number of elderly persons in the Indian population is expected to increase to 173 million in the year 2026. About 80% of this population lives in rural India, making service delivery to them a challenge. After contributing actively to the nation's development, elderly persons often get isolated within the four walls of their homes, completely dependent on family members for their basic day-to-day activities. Even simple arthritis could restrict an elderly person from going to the marketplace, bank, cinema house, and so on. The Constitution of India guarantees equality, freedom, justice, and dignity of all individuals and implicitly mandates an inclusive society for all, including persons with disabilities. Suitable policies and programs have been laid down and initiated by various ministries and departments of the Government of India to address the needs of the disabled, with the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment being the nodal ministry. The fact that India is one of the 106 nations that has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities also legitimately compels us to address the distinct barriers to access faced by the disabled. It is in recognition of the significance of ICTs that the UNCRPD has stressed the obligation of the states to ensure access to ICTs for the disabled. It is apparent that by helping them to effectively communicate and access various services, information, and employment opportunities, etc., ICTs can play an important role in facilitating the socio-economic and political inclusion and mainstreaming of persons with disabilities. However, to play this role, ICTs must be available, they must be affordable, and most of all, they must be truly accessible in the sense that they can be used as easily by a disabled person as by any other person. We understand that by addressing the needs of individual and public access to ICTs for the disabled in rural India, we will also benefit the significant proportion of rural Indians who are aged or illiterate and need assistive technologies to enable them to access ICTs. Given this appreciation, our objectives and our role became very clear to us as we set about to initiate our program. But given our inexperience in this area and the challenges that we anticipated, and in order to test our approach, we decided to launch a number of pilot projects first. These pilot projects will facilitate the provision of ICTs with assistive technologies by way of telecommunications infrastructure, including mobile phones, computers, and other IT hardware, assistive software and content, including real-time information and data banks of books and other relevant material in regional languages. The projects would also cover the aspect of training of both facilitators and persons with disabilities in the use of assistive technologies. The projects are envisaged to cover people with various forms of disability, including sensory, cognitive, and motor disability. We understand that for our projects to be successful, we would need to follow a multi-stakeholder approach. Most of all, we would need to involve the disabled community and their representatives in scheme design, and we did so. We've been doing this over the past 1 year. In this initiative, USOF of India has also enlisted the assistance of various other stakeholders, including inter alia, telecom service providers, telecom equipment manufacturers, application and content providers, non-government organizations, and other ministries and departments. In consultation with our stakeholders, we've identified 3 project categories. These are, firstly, setting up of ICT centers equipped with appropriate assistive technologies for the disabled in rural educational, rehabilitation, and vocational training institutions. Secondly, the provision of mobile handsets with or without access to bundled content for persons with disabilities in rural India. And thirdly, public access to ICT facilities with assistive technologies in the Indian villages. Through this initiative, it is primarily hoped to enrich the lives of the disabled who are provided with ICT-enabled access to information, skills, and employment opportunities. It is expected that this will result in the enhancement of self-reliance of the target beneficiaries and in their integration with and mainstreaming into society. It is also envisaged that the success of these pilots will effectively demonstrate the utility and the benefit of AT-enabled ICTs on the demand side to the disabled, their families, and various institutions, and on the supply side to the telecom service providers, equipment manufacturers, content providers, etc. The scheme is expected to provide an impetus to the development of assistive technologies in relevant content in accessible formats in regional languages. As you're aware, in India we have several different languages spoken in different regions of the country. Finally, it is hoped that the success of these pilots will lead to the scaling up of such initiatives at a national level, not only under subsidy programs of the USOF or any other government organization, but also under the commercial agendas of service providers, equipment manufacturers, application service providers, and content providers. In our efforts as USOF India, we've been ably guided and supported by various ITU experts. And before I close my address, I would like to acknowledge their assistance and their support. I would also like to specifically mention the book that the organizers are to release on the universal service funds and how they can fund and how they can provide access, universal access to ICTs for the disabled across the world. And I found this book very useful. It's a privilege to read it and to learn from it, and I hope that you all will enjoy it too. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Gulati. Yeah, I would like to thank you also for your presentation, but also share with G3 ICT the projects that we've done together in ITU and G3 ICT in this the test on application that you mentioned here. So it was a partnership. Now we have 7 minutes left. I would like to open the floor for question. Please, Andrea, you have the floor. Is there a microphone here? Can someone bring the microphone in the second row here, in the front of me?
Excuse me.
I know everybody knows you, but please introduce yourself.
Well, you certainly helped that along by mentioning my name so many times. Thank you, Dr. Torre. I'm Andrea Sachs. I'm an international telecommunications specialist for the deaf. I've been working with the ITU for 20 years on accessibility issues. I wanted just to point out one thing, and it sort of relates to what Mr. King was talking about, standards being important, and of course being an ITU lady, they are. But there is something that hasn't been said. Standards, oops. It's happening. Standards are voluntary, and conformity tests are necessary because if they're implemented in different ways across the world, we are not going to have compatibility and we are not going to be able to have convergence, which is really important. And I just wanted to point that out because there's another problem with, and I don't mean this to be horrible to industry, but proprietary standards are often creating barriers. And I just want to point this out. We really want industry to work with, for example, the ITU to try and stop doing standards that are proprietary and join the work in the ITU to make accessibility features mainstreamed into standards, and I just thought that needed to be said. Thank you, Dr. Torre.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for this important call. A standard is only good when it's not proprietary, in fact, so it needs to be international so that it brings the cost down and it allows interoperability between many people. So next, okay. Yeah, there is a request. Please bring the microphone here, right here. Yes, on the wheelchair there. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Judy Human. I'm the Special Advisor for International Disability Rights at the U.S. Department of the Department of State. One of the reasons I came to the panel today is I'm trying to get a better understanding of the percentage of disabled individuals in countries that actually have access to mobile phones. And that may be a question which is too specific, but in trying to make the case for agencies like the Department of State to get more involved from a diplomatic perspective on access to information technology, it would be helpful if I could get some basic information. I understand about various research which is being done, etc., but we're also trying to look at this in relationship to economic disadvantage for disabled individuals. Is this problem equivalent to the problem for other populations within countries, or is it a more significant problem? So I would appreciate some comments on this.
Thank you, Judy. As you know, Judy is advising the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, in a very able manner, and I would like to give the floor here. Anybody wants to take on the question here? Yes, please, go ahead.
I'll comment briefly. Hello, Judy. I don't know the actual statistic. I actually thought that the World Health Organization's report had some statistics on that, but I would say in terms of things to watch, my understanding is some of the mobile access in some countries is still more first or second generation, and that the third generation access is starting to accelerate quite a bit. And I think, sorry, I'm not going to be able to give you that specific number, but I am particularly interested in making sure that we can make not only the most basic level of services accessible, but the more smartphone services accessible. And I want to tie that actually to the question from Andrea right before in terms of the standards. I appreciate both of these questions, and I think one of the ways to tie those together is through free and open standards, and so that involve all the stakeholders in developing. So that's something we've been trying to work on, and I think that may help as the more capable mobile phones get deployed in more countries, that the accessibility support in those can be more easily taken advantage of by developers.
Well, Judy's question, please go ahead. I was going to go back to your question again. Please go ahead.
Well, in addition, I'm sorry, I'd also like to note, is one of the areas of weakness government's lack of knowledge about what accessibility should be in the area of ICT, as well as civil society, so that we're not getting governments engaged as they are on other issues?
Yes,
if I may continue. Absolutely. From what I've seen, there are many governments that are still just starting to be aware of the need to make the web accessible in the way they use it in their own countries to enable access to information by everyone in their countries, and have not made that transition yet to realize that mobile devices are a part of that, and in some countries the most important part, and that resources do exist, and that they're freely available, and that more needs to be developed. But I think looking at a coordinated, comprehensive architecture of accessibility support that's integrated into the mainstream applications and handed to the developers who are supporting libraries of techniques and so forth will help move the field along. But awareness is still a major issue in many countries, and I appreciate your question.
Yeah, thank you. I will ask Axel to also make some comments, but I just want to say 2 words here. It's very important to have the access, but also the equipment. Smartphones is very important, and therefore the need for public-private partnership will be very, very important. The policy is there in many countries now. Politicians may sometimes use it, unfortunately, just to get elected or re-elected, and we need to find ways to hold them accountable for it. That's one of the key things that we need to start debating. How do we make sure that those who are making those beautiful resolutions are accountable for implementing them? And we might have to look at ways to start publishing those administrations that are indeed doing the right thing, implementing what they are saying. And of course, also companies that are providing the necessary handheld terminals with broadband accessibility issues. I think that will be very important for us. But Axel, you will probably have some comments on this.
wanted to address Judith's question, which is related to the number of persons with disabilities in countries where mobile phones are being used. And of course, as you know, there is a group called the United Nations Group on Disability Statistics, which has normalized the approach to measure disability from a functional standpoint rather than asking questions about medical status. Now, if you look at the statistics around the world, and we have been in meetings with policymakers in many countries, what's happening is in some meetings you will have a country stand up and say we have 1% for the population with disabilities. The next country says we have 12% of persons with disabilities. And the next country says we have 17%. Now, guess what? They all have the same number of persons with disabilities, more or less. They just measure differently. So, if you look at the worldwide statistics of persons with disabilities in country, and you group those results by, let's say, 1 to 5%, 5 to 10%, 10 to 15%, it's all about the criteria they use to measure disability. It's not about how many people they already have. So, the answer to your question is, to the extent that functional disabilities measure very specific impairment to use things in daily lives, you can actually extrapolate quite easily, based on the number of users of mobile phones, how many persons in each country can be actually can be experiencing a barrier to use mobile technology. So I'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. Industry has a lot of statistics. Operators have a lot of statistics. You will hear a lot of explanation this afternoon from Japan and France and other parts of the world where those numbers have been studied in great detail. So there is a huge issue that can be easily demonstrated. So I just wanted to make that point, and sorry for being a bit long on that response.
Thank you. We are running out of time. Chairman Genachowski is already here. He's always on time. He works like a Swiss clock. You know, but you know, as you know, I'm not the one who invented the days with just 24 hours. I could have done better if I was the one. We're running out of time, but we'll give opportunity for one more comment here. And Professor Obi is in the room as well. He would like to make a comment. So please be short. Mr. Fouad, you have the floor.
About this consideration, we want to share with you the experience of telecom operators who made like a private initiative without any incentive from the governments or from the politic. So like we have in Egypt, one of the operators are offering the mobile speak solution for all the blind users. In Morocco, Maroc Telecom also. And now we are looking to have a new contract with Lebanese operators. So all these initiatives are from the private sector. Can you imagine if there have some regulation to practice or to apply, and how much it could be important and interesting to offer it like for free for any blind user, the solution to get connected with the mobile operator. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Professor Obi from Waseda University in Japan. Please bring the microphone here. It's our last speaker before Chairman Genachowski makes the remarks.
Thank you very much. I will be from Waseda University, Tokyo, Japan. Thank you for very interesting presentations. And our survey, social survey in Japan for seniors and people with disability, showing some fear of the using smartphone because of the lack of cyber security and the cyber crime. And of course, they are knowing about the accessibilities and the usabilities and affordabilities. So a rising concern for seniors and people with disability might be cyber security and the crime issues. And if you have any some comment from your side, I'd like to have some, like ITU may have the very strong issue concerned for cybersecurity, but how about for people with disability and senior people to protect them?
Yeah, this is very important theme. I'm actually going on Friday to New York to make a presentation at the ECOSOC on cybersecurity, and this is indeed one of the key issues that we're addressing. We're also addressing the issue of accessibility in the issue of international telecommunication regulations, another big conference that we'll be holding next year in November in Dubai, looking at ways of means of embedding persons with disabilities, their rights into the international telecommunication regulations. And therefore, these are very important topics. Security and privacy are key element of anything we do, and I believe that this is very important, and especially privacy. I will not elaborate much further. Time is short. I would now like to introduce our speaker, Julius Genachowski, the chairman of the Federal Communication Commission. Mr. Genachowski, please welcome.
I see so many friends and colleagues from around the world here today, and I'm so proud that the FCC is hosting this event. Often I get to see many of you in other countries, and it's just excellent that to be able to offer our facilities at the FCC for these very important topics. I understand that there are about 365 participants who've signed up to participate in this from 30 countries. It's being streamed online, and so we have even more people participating online. This is, as you all know, it's the first global initiative to expand the benefits of wireless technologies to all senior citizens and people with disabilities around the world. Simply shining a light on these topics and bringing together people from the private sector, NGOs, and government to talk about that, just doing that will make a positive difference. But I understand from these morning sessions already that there's reason to think that the concrete progress that will come out of these sessions will be even greater than that. There are so many people to thank for bringing this together. The Global Initiative for Inclusive Information and Communications Technologies, 3GICT, which organized this summit. Axel Lebois, Francesca Cesabianchi, and Christine Forget-Lebois deserve special thanks for their work in putting this event together. Thank you to all the speakers and panelists this morning. Is Kareem Dale here? I think he was here earlier this morning from the White House. Dr. Toure, of course, and Mohammed Al-Tarana from the UN. Thank you to the team at the FCC that's worked so hard on this and on all the work that we're doing in the United States and at the FCC on these issues. Karen Pelt-Strauss, who many of you around the world know for a career of commitment to these issues, as well as the other staffers here who have worked with Karen and on these issues and with so many of you for a long time, Pam Gregory, Jamal Mazrui, so many other FCC staff. I'm proud to say that these issues are ones where we both have focused, dedicated personnel working on them, and we've made it a horizontal priority for the Commission. And so, in fact, people from every single bureau and office at the FCC have participated in this event and work on these issues at the FCC. My personal commitment to accessibility issues has deep roots. As some of you may know, when I was in high school, I went on a college trip with my father, and we were in Boston, and he dragged me to MIT, where he had studied engineering as a graduate student, and he took me into one of the libraries deep into the stacks, and eventually he found the thesis that he had worked on as a grad student while studying engineering. And it turned out that the thesis was to develop a device that would, he hoped, someday help blind people read words on paper. He imagined a device that blind people would have in their hands, roll over the paper, see the difference between black and white, and translate it into physical signals like Braille with pinpricks into the hand. As it turned out, this story doesn't end with my father getting a patent and all of us living happily ever after. He was a mechanical engineer. He probably should have been an electrical engineer, but that experience with my father and learning more about his work, his commitment, have taught me a powerful lesson that stayed with me all of these years. And that is that technology, and in particular communications technology, has the power to transform lives for the better. And that everyone should have access to communications technology. We see this so many different ways. Just last week at the FCC in this room, we were pleased to be able to authorize a new use of spectrum that will literally help paraplegics walk, people who've lost arm movement through strokes, be able to regain movement. We know that access to broadband and wireless technologies means tremendous opportunity, a material equalization of opportunity in so many different ways. I just gave one example. Other examples relate to our economy. These technologies can give people who otherwise wouldn't have access to jobs and economic opportunity, access to jobs and economic opportunity. People can telecommute. About 8 weeks ago, we were able to announce in Indiana an initiative with the American teleservices industry to commit to create 100,000 new broadband-enabled teleservices jobs in the U.S. in the next 2 years. Many of those jobs, as many as 50%, will be at-home jobs, where all that's necessary is a computer and a broadband connection. It may be the single largest jobs initiative for people with disabilities that we've ever seen, but of course technology enables this. Seniors, too, can participate in online commerce or engage in civic dialogue. I was in Cleveland, Ohio last year at a center to help seniors learn about new technologies. And I met, just walking through that center was amazing. The first senior I met showed me how she had learned to send photos back and forth with her grandchildren in South Carolina, far away. The next senior I met told me that she was able to find and land a job. She still wanted to work because she had learned basic digital skills and had access to listings. And the third senior I met was showing me the ways she was able to get information online about health issues, including her diabetes. Mobile broadband also enables remote medical monitoring. Wireless devices can help diabetes patients track their glucose levels, or heart disease patients monitor cardiovascular data. I was in Seattle, in the state of Washington in the U.S., where I met parents and a child where the child's life was saved because he had had access to remote monitoring technology that alerted emergency personnel when something went wrong with his heart. He had a heart condition, if you waited till the actual visible physical symptoms, it would have been too late. I mentioned finding a job. Broadband presents such an opportunity for that. In the U.S. now, more than 80% of our largest companies, Fortune 500 companies, post their job openings online only and require online applications. Those statistics are different in different parts of the world, but the trend is clear. And by anticipating these trends around the world, we can make a real difference in enabling everyone to have a full opportunity to find and land the jobs that are available. Seniors and people with disabilities disproportionately find themselves on the wrong side of the digital divide, excluded from the $8 trillion global internet economy and all of its benefits. In the 21st century, having millions sitting on the sidelines of society because they're offline is as unthinkable as leaving people without electricity in the 20th century. That's why here at the FCC, we've made our highest priority ensuring that every American has access to broadband, fixed and mobile. In the last few weeks, the FCC approved a once-in-a-generation overhaul of our multi-billion-dollar Universal Service Fund, modernizing it finally from the telephone era to the internet era. These reforms will drive broadband build-out, wired and wireless, to the millions of unserved homes, businesses, and community anchor institutions in rural America. And I think it's certainly a model to pay attention to for the rest of the world, and we are available to help in this important matter. The new Connect America Fund and the new Mobility Fund will put our nation on the path to universal broadband access, closing our deployment gap and helping close the broadband adoption gap. But even with those reforms, we still have way too many Americans who aren't getting the benefits of broadband, even though they could connect at home. In the months ahead, we'll continue reform and modernization of our Lifeline program, which helps low-income families get and stay connected to basic communication service. We've modernized our E-Rate program, which is our program that helps schools and libraries in the United States get access to the internet. It's a good program, a very good program, a very successful one that we've had in place in the U.S. Since the 1990s. But like so many programs, it needed to be modernized to address the challenges that schools and teachers and libraries face today. We adopted important reforms of that program last year, giving a spark to wonderful opportunities like digital textbooks. There's no reason this thing shouldn't be a textbook, although when I pick it up, I turn it off apparently. The FCC recently worked with the private sector, not only on the Jobs for America teleservices initiative that I mentioned, but also on a new broadband adoption initiative called Connect to Compete. So every cable company in the United States has committed to offering a $10 a month low-cost broadband service to families who have children on school lunch, low-income families in the United States. Other companies like Microsoft and Best Buy have made significant commitments to help on the digital literacy issue. We know that there are multiple causes for the broadband adoption gap. Cost is one, but so is relevance, people not appreciating the value of broadband. Another is digital literacy, people who just don't know how to use a computer, search, upload applications, photos, etc. All of these issues matter a great deal to people with disabilities and seniors. I'm sure you've already spoken this morning about the CVAA, which we passed in the United States, a historic piece of legislation which contains a number of requirements to ensure that wireless phones are accessible to people who use hearing aids and implants. Over the past year and a half, we've held a summit on ways to ensure that mobile devices are accessible to people who are blind, visually impaired, or deafblind, and have requested comments on how we can make sure that individuals who use wireless devices are able to access wireless phones in the 21st century. Just last month, we released proposed rules to update the technical standards for wireless hearing aid compatibility. The new standards will allow hearing aid compatibility requirements to be extended to a range of new technologies and will allow for more accurate measurement of hearing aid interference. Just as important, as part of our national broadband plan last year, I'm glad we were able to establish the Accessibility and Innovation Initiative to address gaps between cutting-edge technologies and accessibility by bringing stakeholders, such as all of you, together to discuss how to increase accessibility in products, services, and software. This is a big opportunity in this space because historically we've gone through these cycles that have been frustrating for everyone involved. A new technology comes on the market, becomes a very accepted common technology, and then people realize, oh, people with disabilities don't have access to the technology. There's understandable, real material frustration on the part of people with disabilities. And then for the companies, the challenge of retrofitting at that point becomes an expensive challenge. What we are looking to do now in the United States with the law that Congress passed and the President signed last year, with our work here at the agency, is to work with the private sector to address accessibility issues early in the product development cycle, reducing the cost, making it a win-win for everyone. And I think we're seeing progress toward that. It does require these kinds of gatherings and ongoing focus. So are we there yet? No. But we are on our way. The new technologies, the devices, the software create enormous and amazing new opportunities. We, of course, realize that as we move forward, every day we learn from initiatives going on in other countries. We will all make the best progress together if these are two-way dialogues. There is no reason that any country, including the United States, should have to reinvent the wheel. So this international conference is a tremendous opportunity to meet these profoundly important objectives for all of you from all of the different sectors involved in these issues to meet, collaborate with your colleagues and partners around the world, and to keep our collective aim on increasing the amount of products that are accessible to every individual, no matter where they live or work or learn. I'm pleased that the work will continue past this conference. In fact, the FCC will pick up these issues again on Wednesday of this week, when, along with the G3 ICT and the W2I, will host an international inquiry on broadband and persons with disabilities. The goal of Wednesday's event is to create a roadmap for international broadband plan for people with disabilities. The working groups will start by identifying issues associated with broadband deployment and adoption barriers, needed research, challenges, and incentives for broadband and people with disabilities. So thank you all again, the panelists, the participants, for taking the time to be here, to work together in the spirit that we all share. Over the next several days, you're going to invest real time and energies into a goal that couldn't be more worthy, identifying the best ways to achieve broad accessibility of communications technologies. I applaud your work, and I wish you well and a productive few days. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much again. Chairman, as you know, is very much committed in the ITU's Broadband Commission. He's one of the 50 commissioners in the world, and has shown his tremendous commitment to this agenda as well. I would like to take the opportunity to thank him for the wonderful facilities that are provided to us for this conference, the support and the support team as well, and the commitment and leadership. Indeed, you are leading by example, and I would like to therefore take this opportunity to thank all our panelists. Please give them a hand again. Let's commit ourselves to continue to work together to make this world a better place for all. Thank you very much again. And now I would like to pass the floor to Karen, who will give us some logistical information.
Okay, first, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that inspiring speech. You can see why it's so easy for me to work here and for all of us to get as much done as we can. I would like to announce that lunch is now available. If you walk straight down the hall, there will be people right outside here to tell you where to go. Anybody that needs lunch brought to you in this room, there will be people also bringing in some of the box lunches. As of 1:15, there will be buses available out front where you were dropped off. Is that correct? Would you like to add anything? No, I think that's about good. Okay, and those buses will bring you to the Gaylord, and the conference will resume at 2:30. Thank you very much. Enjoy lunch.